The screams echoed through the canyon walls as flames consumed the last wagon. Eleanor Mitchell pressed herself deeper into the rocky crevice, her body trembling as she watched her fellow travelers fall one by one. The outlaws had struck without warning, emerging from the shadows of Dry Creek Pass like demons at dusk. Their laughter mingled with gunshots as they tore through the small caravan, claiming what little the settlers possessed. Ellie's throat burned with unspoken pleas as she watched the expedition leader, the man who had promised safe passage to Fort Davis, abandon his charges and flee into the darkness. Now, as moonlight spilled across the carnage, she remained, the sole survivor hidden among the stones, her fate hanging by the frailest thread. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The attack had come without warning. One moment, Ellie had been sitting beside the cookfire, writing in her journal about the Texas landscape that had captivated her since leaving St. Louis. The next, bullets splintered the wooden table beside her. She'd instinctively dropped to the ground as chaos erupted around her. Men shouted orders that dissolved into screams. Women clutched children to their chests before falling silent forever. Ellie had crawled beneath the supply wagon, her heart thundering against her ribs. The schoolteacher's hands, once steady while guiding chalk across a slate board, now trembled uncontrollably as she clawed at the dirt, desperate to make herself invisible. A stray bullet had grazed her shoulder, the burning pain almost causing her to cry out, but she'd bitten down on her sleeve instead, tasting dirt and copper as she forced herself to remain silent. Hours had passed since the last of the outlaws had departed, their saddlebags heavy with stolen goods, their consciences unburdened by the lives they'd taken. Yet Ellie remained frozen in her hiding place, afraid that the slightest movement might reveal her presence to any bandits who lingered. Nearby, the night air carried the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes began to howl, drawn by the promise of an easy feast. When she finally found the courage to move, her limbs protested. After hours of immobility, she emerged cautiously from the crevice, her blue calico dress torn and stained with her own blood. The wound on her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, but it was far from the worst of her concerns. The wagons had been reduced to smoldering frames, their contents scattered across the pass. Bodies lay where they had fallen, familiar faces, now unrecognizable in death. Ellie stumbled toward what remained of the supply wagon, desperate to find anything that might help her survive. The outlaws had been thorough. No food remained, no water, no weapons save for a broken knife handle that she clutched gratefully nonetheless. The hills surrounding Dry Creek Pass stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no hint of civilization, no promise of rescue. Her years in the schoolhouse hadn't prepared her for this. The journey west was supposed to be her fresh start. After losing her parents and brother to the fever that had swept through St. Louis, the advertisement seeking a teacher for the new settlement had seemed like providence. Now that dream lay shattered among the wreckage of the wagon train. The logical part of her mind, the part that had always served her well as an educator, assessed her situation with brutal clarity. She had no supplies, minimal protection, and no clear direction to safety. The nearest settlement was at least 4 days' travel on horseback, on foot, injured and without provisions. The calculation was grim, but beneath the schoolteacher's practical exterior beat the heart of a survivor. Ellie had weathered loss before. She had rebuilt from nothing when the war took her childhood home. She would not surrender now to the Texas wilderness, no matter how vast or unforgiving it might be. She tore strips from her petticoat to bind her wounded shoulder, wincing as she pulled the makeshift bandage tight. From a dead man's pocket, she recovered a compass, its brass casing dented but the needle still true. She knew from the expedition maps that following the creek eastward would eventually lead to the Brazos River, and settlements could be found along its banks. As dawn broke across the sky, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of amber and gold, Ellie took one final look at the remnants of her shattered dreams. Then, with nothing but a broken knife, a damaged compass, and the clothes on her back, she began to walk. The Texas hill country showed no mercy to the unprepared. By midday, the October sun beat down relentlessly, turning the dry creek bed into a shimmering mirage. Ellie's lips cracked from dehydration, her tongue swollen and rough against the roof of her mouth. Each step became a negotiation with her failing body, each mile a test of will against instinct. Just to that ridgeline, she promised herself, focusing on the rocky outcropping ahead rather than the endless journey beyond it. Make it there, then rest. But when she reached the ridge, she merely set another goal. A lone oak tree, a distinctive boulder. Always another landmark, another reason to take one more step. As dusk approached, bringing little relief from the heat, Ellie spotted a cluster of prickly pear cacti. With trembling hands, she used the broken knife to slice away the spines, then cut into the flesh of the plant. The moisture inside was bitter and slimy, but she sucked at it gratefully, the liquid soothing her parched throat even as it made her stomach clench. Night in the wilderness brought new terrors. Without the wagon's protective circle, without the comfort of campfires and companions, Ellie huddled beneath an overhanging rock, the darkness pressing in around her. Every rustle in the brush, every distant call of a hunting owl sent her heart racing. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by shivers as the temperature dropped and the winds picked up. By the second day, her strength had begun to wane. Tea, wound on her shoulder, had grown hot and angry, red streaks radiating outward from beneath the dirty bandage. Fever clouded her thoughts, making the compass needle dance and shift before her eyes. Still, she pressed onward, stumbling more often, now falling once and cutting her palm on the sharp limestone. It was during one of these falls, as the sun slipped behind the hills on the second day, that Ellie first sensed she was being watched. The feeling came suddenly, a prickling awareness that raised the fine hairs on the back of her neck. She froze, the broken knife clutched in her bleeding hand, and scanned the rocky terrain around her. Nothing moved against the gathering shadows, yet the sensation persisted. Someone or something was tracking her progress through the hills. "Hello." Her voice emerged as little more than a croak, immediately swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered, broken by the distant cry of a hunting hawk. But as Ellie forced herself back to her feet, she caught a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of a juniper grove, then vanishing just as quickly. Fear gave her renewed strength. She quickened her pace despite her exhaustion, no longer stopping to rest or gather what meager sustenance the land offered. The feeling of pursuit dogged her steps as darkness fell completely, transforming the familiar hills into an alien landscape of twisted shadows. When she could go no farther, Ellie collapsed beside a shallow depression in the earth, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. The fever burned hotter now, painting the world in wavering lines and phantom shapes. She no longer knew if her stalker was real or merely a product of her delirious mind. Somewhere in the night, it began to rain, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the dry creek bed into a rushing torrent within minutes. The water rose quickly around her resting place, jolting Ellie from her feverish stupor. She scrambled upward, desperate to escape the flash flood, but her weakened legs betrayed her. The current caught her, pulling her down the newly formed channel with terrifying speed. Water filled her nose and mouth as she fought against the flood, her arms flailing uselessly against the powerful surge. Rocks tore at her skin as she was dragged across the creek bed. This then would be her end, not at the hands of outlaws or exposure, but claimed by the very water she had so desperately sought. As consciousness began to fade, strong hands suddenly seized her arms, pulling her from the current's deadly embrace. Through water-blurred eyes, Ellie caught a glimpse of her rescuer, a man with copper skin and obsidian eyes, his long hair plastered against his shoulders by the rain. A Comanche warrior. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her was the strange gentleness of those hands as they lifted her from the flood. When Ellie next opened her eyes, she found herself beneath an overhanging ledge, sheltered from the continuing downpour. A small fire crackled nearby, its warmth penetrating the bone-deep chill that had settled into her body. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She tried to sit up but found her limbs too weak to obey. "Be still." The voice came from behind her, the English heavily accented but understandable. "The fever takes your strength." The Comanche warrior moved into her field of vision, crouching beside her with a wooden cup in his hands. His face was serious, his features sharp in the firelight, but there was no malice in his expression as he studied her, only curiosity and perhaps a hint of concern. "Why?" Ellie's voice broke, and she swallowed painfully before trying again. "Why did you save me?" Instead of answering, he held the cup to her lips. "Drink." The liquid inside was bitter, some kind of herbal tea that made her grimace. But she drank obediently, too weak to refuse and too desperate for hydration to care about the taste. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell," she said when she had finished, compelled by some instinct to establish herself as a person rather than merely prey or enemy. "I was traveling to Fort Davis. There was an attack." "I know." The warrior placed the cup beside the fire. "I followed the killer's trail, found you instead." A chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes ran through Ellie. "You were hunting them? The men who attacked our wagon train?" He nodded once, his expression hardening. "They raid our hunting grounds, kill our game. Now they kill your people too." He paused, studying her face. "I am Windrunner." The introduction seemed significant somehow, a concession granted reluctantly. Ellie realized that by giving her his name, he was acknowledging her humanity in a way that transcended the boundaries between their peoples. "Thank you for saving me, Windrunner," she said softly. His only response was a slight incline of his head before he turned back to the fire, ending the conversation as definitively as if he had walked away. The message was clear. She had been saved, but she was not welcome, not truly. As the night deepened and the rain gradually subsided, Ellie drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever dreams came vividly, visions of the attack mixed with memories of her classroom in St. Louis, of her parents' final days, of the long journey that had brought her to this moment. Through it all, she remained distantly aware of Windy, Runner's presence, his quiet movements as he tended the fire or checked her wound. By morning, the fever had broken. Ellie awakened to find her shoulder rebandaged with clean cloth and strange-smelling poultice. Her torn dress had been covered with a simple deerskin blanket while she slept. Of Windrunner, there was no sign. She sat up cautiously, testing her returning strength. The shelter was empty, save for a small bundle placed beside her. Jerky, dried berries, and a water skin. He had left her supplies, but had chosen not to remain himself. The realization brought a confusing mixture of relief and disappointment. Ellie had just finished a small meal of the provisions when a shadow darkened the entrance to the shelter. Windrunner stood there, watching her with that same inscrutable expression. "You are stronger today," he observed. "Yes, thanks to you." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her since she awakened. "No one fled," she said, frowning. "They were all killed. I survived because I hid." Windrunner shook his head. 3 horses fled west, carrying riders. They abandoned the fight. The revelation struck Ellie like a physical blow. 3 survivors. 3 people who had left the others to die, who had made no attempt to return or send help. The expedition leader would have been one of them, the man who had promised safety in exchange for the settlers' pooled resources. "I didn't know," she whispered, her appetite suddenly gone. "I thought I was the only one." Windrunner seemed to sense the shift in her mood. "They were not worthy of your loyalty," he said simply, as if stating an obvious truth. "No, Ellie." "Agreed," a new hardness entering her voice. "They weren't." That night, as she lay beside the dying fire, Ellie found herself at a crossroads. The path Windrunner had laid out for her was clear. Rest, recover, then make her way to the river, and follow it to the nearest settlement. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice, but something had changed inside her. The knowledge that others had survived the attack only to abandon their companions had awakened a fierce anger that burned hotter than her fever had. And beneath that anger lay a seed of determination that had begun to take root. "Windrunner," she said softly, knowing he was still awake, though he lay motionless on the opposite side of the fire. "I want to go with you." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, without moving, he said, "No." "I can help," she persisted. "I know what they looked like, what weapons they carried. I know their leader's name, Mason Holt. I heard the others call him that." "You would slow me down. I'm stronger than I look." Now Windrunner did move, rising to a sitting position to fix her with an incredulous stare. "You nearly died from a fever. You know nothing of tracking, of hunting. You would die in the hills." "I nearly died because I was alone and unprepared," Ellie countered, sitting up as well. "I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to let me help bring justice to the people who murdered my friends." "Justice?" He almost scoffed at the word. "I hunt them because they threaten my people's hunting grounds, not for your justice." "Then call it revenge," she said, a hardness in her voice that surprised even her. "Either way, they deserve to pay for what they've done." Windrunner studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of the embers. Finally, he lay back down, turning his back to her. "Sleep," he said, his tone brooking no further argument. "We will speak of this when the sun returns." But when Ellie awakened the next morning, Windrunner was gone. The fire had been carefully extinguished, the remaining supplies arranged neatly beside her. He had made his decision without further discussion, choosing to continue his hunt alone rather than burden himself with her presence. Disappointment and anger warred within her as she gathered the supplies. She had been dismissed, her desire for justice or revenge deemed unworthy of consideration. The warrior had saved her life only to abandon her to her fate, just as the expedition leaders had done. "No," she muttered, tightening the straps on the small bundle of provisions. "Not this time." Instead of heading east toward the river, as Windrunner had instructed, Ellie studied the ground outside the shelter, searching for signs of his passage. She was no tracker, but the recent rain had left the earth soft. His footprints were visible, leading southwest toward a line of hills that marked the boundary of Comanche hunting territory. It was madness to follow him. She knew this even as she set out, forcing her still weak legs to carry her across the uneven terrain. Windrunner was right. She had no skills for this pursuit, no knowledge of survival beyond what little she had gleaned in her 2 desperate days alone. But the alternative, meekly accepting her role as victim and survivor while others determined her fate, was suddenly unthinkable. The morning stretched into afternoon, the October sun warm on her shoulders. As she followed Windrunner's trail, He made no attempt to conceal his passage, clearly not expecting pursuit. But as the day wore on, Ellie began to realize the flaw in her impulsive plan. His stride was much longer than hers, his pace far quicker. The distance between them grew, with each passing hour. By midday, exhaustion forced her to rest beneath the shade of a gnarled oak. Her shoulder throbbed, though the strange poultice Windrunner had applied seemed to be fighting the infection. As she sipped cautiously from the water skin, conserving its precious contents, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Across the small valley below her resting place, a group of riders appeared. 5 men on horseback, moving with the casual confidence of those who feared no pursuit. Even at this distance, Ellie recognized the distinctive silhouette of their leader, Mason Holt, his broad-brimmed hat and the rifle slung across his back, unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. The outlaws. Here, less than half a mile. Away, close enough that she could see the sunlight glinting off their weapons, and she was alone, unarmed save for the small knife Windrunner had left among the supplies. Instinctively, Ellie pressed herself against the trunk of the oak, making herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. The riders showed no sign of having spotted her. They continued their unhurried progress along the floor of the valley, heading northwest toward a pass between 2 hills. As they disappeared from view, Ellie released the breath she'd been holding. Then a new realization struck her. If she had found the outlaws, Windrunner couldn't be far behind. He was hunting them, tracking their movements just as she was now tracking his. With renewed determination, she abandoned her rest and set off. Again, no longer following Windrunner's trail, but moving parallel to the path the outlaws had taken. If she could locate them again, she might find him as well. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as she approached the pass. Loose shale made each step treacherous, threatening to send her sliding down the steep hillside. The wound on her shoulder pulled painfully as she used her arms to steady herself against rocks and scrubby junipers. It was near dusk when she heard the first gunshot. The sharp crack echoed off the canyon walls, followed quickly by several more in rapid succession. Then a cry of pain that was neither English nor Comanche, but the universal sound of agony that needed no translation. Heart racing, Ellie scrambled toward the source of the sounds, abandoning caution in her haste. She crested a small rise and found herself looking down into a narrow box canyon. Below, the scene unfolded like something from a nightmare. 4 of the outlaws had taken cover behind rocks and fallen trees, their rifles aimed at a cluster of boulders on the opposite side of the canyon. The 5th man lay motionless on the ground, an arrow protruding from his chest. Windrunner was pinned down behind the boulders, occasionally rising to loose another arrow before ducking back as bullets ricocheted off the rocks around him. It was an uneven match. Windrunner's bow, deadly as it was, could not match the range or rate of fire of the outlaws' rifles. Sooner or later, they would flank his position, or he would run out of arrows. Either way, his death was all but certain. Without conscious thought, Ellie found herself moving again, circling around to approach the canyon from above the outlaws' position. A plan formed in her mind. Desperate, reckless, but the only chance Windrunner had. She gathered several fist-sized rocks she went, testing their weight in her palm. When she had positioned herself directly above the gunman, Ellie took a deep breath to steady her nerves. Then, with all her remaining strength, she hurled the first rock down into the canyon. It struck one of the outlaws squarely between the shoulder blades, causing him to cry out and stagger forward. Immediately, the others whirled, searching for this new threat, their attention momentarily diverted from Windrunner. It was the opening he needed. In a blur of movement, the Comanche warrior emerged from cover, his bow singing as he released arrow after arrow in rapid succession. 2 more outlaws fell before the remaining pair realized their error and swung their rifles back toward him. Ellie didn't wait to see more. She sent another rock hurtling downward, then another, forcing the gunmen to divide their attention between threats. One of them fired wildly in her direction, the bullet whining off the cliff face inches from her head. The distraction proved fatal. Windrunner closed the distance to the nearest outlaw with astonishing speed, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. There was a brief struggle, a flash of steel, and then the man collapsed, clutching at his throat. Only Mason Holt remained, standing now, his rifle leveled at Windrunner as the warrior approached. Ellie held her breath, another rock poised in her hand, searching for a clear shot. But before she could act, Holt's rifle jammed, a misfire that cost him precious seconds. Windrunner didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, driving his knife upward, beneath the outlaw's ribs. Holt gasped, his face contorting in shock and pain as he dropped to his knees. The Comanche warrior stepped back, watching dispassionately as the life faded from his enemy's eyes. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the harsh sound of Windrunner's breathing and the distant call of a circling vulture. 5 bodies lay scattered across the blood-soaked ground. Justice, or revenge, had been served. Ellie made her way carefully down to the canyon floor, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. Windrunner turned as she approached, his expression a mixture of surprise, anger, and something else she couldn't quite name. "I told you to go east," he said, his voice flat, "to the river." "Yes, you did." Ellie glanced at the bodies surrounding them, feeling neither triumph nor horror, only a strange emptiness. "But I made a different choice." Windrunner wiped his knife clean against his leggings before resheathing it. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she countered. "Those rocks bought you the time you needed." For a long moment he simply stared at her, as if seeing her properly for the first time. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement that felt more significant than any words of gratitude might have been. "Come," he said finally, turning toward the mouth of the canyon. "Night approaches. We need shelter." Ellie followed without question, understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them. She was no longer simply a burden to be, directed towards safety or abandoned to her fate. She had proven herself useful, perhaps even worthy of a measure of respect. As they made camp that night, beneath an overhanging ledge similar to their previous shelter, Windrunner broke his customary silence to ask her about her life before the attack, about the teaching position that had drawn her westward, about the family she had lost to fever. He spoke little of himself in return, but Ellie gleaned fragments, a childhood spent learning the ways of the hunt, the death of his parents during a smallpox outbreak, his ambivalent position within his tribe, as both valued hunter and suspected sympathizer with the white settlers. "My people call me Wakaria," he said, pronouncing the name carefully, "but the traders gave me the name Windrunner. Which do you prefer?" Ellie asked. He considered the question seriously before answering. "Among my people, I am Wakaria. Among yours," he shrugged. "Names have power. Each serves its purpose." The following morning brought a new dilemma. The outlaws were dead. Windrunner's hunt concluded successfully. By rights, he should return to his tribe, and Ellie should continue eastward to the river and the settlements beyond. Their paths, temporarily aligned, now diverged once more. "What will you do now?" she asked as they shared a breakfast of dried meat. Windrunner's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested conflict. "Return to my people. The hunting season grows short before winter comes." "And I should head east," Ellie said, more statement than question. He nodded once, sharp and definitive, yet he made no immediate move to depart, instead studying the horizon with unusual intensity. "The river is still 2 days' walk," he said finally. "The path is not easy." Ellie waited, sensing there was more he wished to say. "I could show you the way," he continued after a long pause. "Ensure you find the trading post safely." The offer surprised her, though she was careful not to show it. "Wouldn't that delay your return to your people?" 3 days, perhaps 4. He shrugged as if the matter were of little consequence. The hunt was successful. There is no urgency, but they both recognized the lie in his casual dismissal. For a Comanche warrior to escort a white woman to a settlement, even one as remote and lawless as the trading post, represented a risk far greater than he acknowledged. If they encountered other settlers or soldiers along the way, questions would be asked, assumptions would be made. Windrunner's life would be in danger simply for being in her company. "Why would you do that?" Ellie asked quietly. Windrunner met her gaze directly. "You helped defeat a common enemy. Honor demands I ensure your safety in return." It was a convenient explanation, one that preserved his dignity while justifying an action that might otherwise seem inexplicable. Ellie accepted it with a nod, knowing that to press further would only cause him to withdraw. "Then I accept your help with gratitude," she said simply. They set out within the hour, traveling eastward toward the promise of the river. Windrunner moved with the confident stride of one intimately familiar with the landscape, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sources of water that Ellie would have overlooked entirely. For her part, she matched his pace as best she could, refusing to complain even when her wounded shoulder throbbed or her legs threatened to buckle with exhaustion. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising another storm. Windrunner frowned at the sky, clearly concerned by the weather's turn. "We must find shelter before the rain comes," he said, altering their course slightly to head toward a line of limestone bluffs in the distance. "The lowlands flood quickly here." They reached the bluffs just as the first fat droplets began to fall. Windrunner led her to a shallow cave set into the rock face, its entrance partially concealed by scrubby juniper bushes. Inside, the remnants of an old fire pit suggested the place had served as shelter before. "Comanche?" Ellie asked, gesturing to the fire pit as Windrunner gathered dry twigs to start a new fire. He shook his head. "Traveler, perhaps trader." He paused, then added, "The land belongs to no one. All seek shelter from its storms." As if to emphasize his point, a crack of thunder shook the ground beneath them, followed immediately by a deluge so intense that the cave entrance became a curtain of water. The temperature dropped rapidly as the storm intensified, the October air turning bitter with unexpected cold. Ellie huddled closer to the small fire Windrunner had built, grateful for its warmth, but unable to stop the shivers that ran through her body. Her dress, never fully dried from the previous drenching, clung to her skin like a layer of ice. "You need dry clothing," Windrunner observed, his practical tone devoid of embarrassment or impropriety. From his small pack, he withdrew a spare buckskin shirt, offering it to her without ceremony. "Turn away. I will not look." Proper Boston-raised, schoolteacher that she was, Ellie should have refused, but survival had a way of stripping away social niceties along with everything else. She nodded gratefully, waiting until Windrunner had turned his back before quickly changing out of her sodden dress into the buckskin shirt. It was far too large for her frame, but blessedly dry and still carrying some of his body's warmth. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished. "You can turn around now." If the sight of her in his clothing affected him in any way, Windrunner gave no sign of it. He merely nodded once before returning his attention to the fire, adding small branches to build up its heat. Outside, the storm continued unabated, the rain transforming the landscape into a series of rushing streams and temporary waterfalls. They were effectively trapped until the weather cleared, a reality that should have made Ellie uncomfortable, but instead brought an unexpected sense of security. Here, in this small cave with this enigmatic man who had saved her life, she felt safer than she had since leaving St. Louis. "Tell me about the trading post," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "What is it like?" Windrunner considered the question before answering. "A place between worlds, not Comanche, not settler. Both come to trade, to drink, sometimes to fight." His expression suggested he found the place distasteful. "Some of my people have taken jobs there. Guides, hunters, they learn your ways." "And do you go there often?" "When necessary." He prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. "I trade furs for powder, for metal tools. I do not stay." Ellie tried to picture this place that existed in the borderlands between cultures. Not quite civilization as she understood it, yet not entirely wild either. Would she find a place there, at least temporarily? Could she rebuild some semblance of a life from the ashes of her former dreams? "What will you do there?" Windrunner asked, seemingly reading her thoughts. "When you reach the trading post." The question caught her off guard. In truth, she had been so focused on survival that she had given little thought to what would come after. The teaching position she had journeyed so far to claim no longer existed. The settlement it had been meant for lay in ruins alongside Dry Creek Pass. "I don't know," she admitted. "Find work, I suppose. Save enough money to either continue west or return east." Windrunner nodded, accepting her uncertainty without judgment. "You have skills. The trading post has no teacher for the children." The suggestion startled her. "There are children there?" "Yes. Traders bring families. Some marry local women." He hesitated, then added, "Children with no place in either world, like the trading post itself." Something in his tone made Ellie wonder if he spoke from personal experience, if perhaps his own position as neither fully accepted by his tribe nor by the white settlers stemmed from similar circumstances. But she knew better than to ask directly. "Perhaps there is work for me there then," she said instead, "though I've lost all my books, all my teaching materials." "Words are in your head," Windrunner replied simply, "not in books." The observation, straightforward as it was, struck Ellie as profound. Throughout her education and brief teaching career, she had relied heavily on texts and formal curricula. The idea of teaching from knowledge carried within her, from experience and memory, rather than printed pages, was both frightening and strangely liberating. As darkness fell and the storm gradually subsided to a gentle patter, they shared the last of Windrunner's provisions. The conversation dwindled, replaced by the comfortable silence of people who no longer felt compelled to fill the space between. Then with words, Ellie found herself studying him covertly in the firelight, noting the careful precision of his movements, the watchful awareness that never seemed to leave him even in moments of apparent rest. He was a contradiction, a man capable of ruthless violence who had nevertheless shown her unexpected kindness, a member of a tribe that regularly clashed with settlers who had chosen to ensure her safety. The question that had lingered unspoken since he'd pulled her from the floodwaters finally forced its way to her lips. "Why did you really save me, Windrunner? You could have left me to drown. No one would have known." He looked up from the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Ellie thought he might once again deflect her question, but then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "3 summers ago, soldiers came to our winter camp. I was hunting. My sister was not." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "When I returned, she was gone. Taken. Some said killed." He paused, his gaze returning to the fire. "A farmer's wife found her, gave her shelter, food, helped her return to our people." The admission clearly cost him something. His hands, usually so steady, clenched and unclenched as he spoke. "Your sister," Ellie said softly, "is she?" "She lives," Windrunner confirmed. with a slight nod. "She has a husband now, a child." His eyes met Ellie's again. "The woman who helped her. She had hair the color of sunset, like yours." Understanding dawned slowly. "You saved me because I reminded you of her." "No. Wind." Runner shook his head. "I saved you because she taught me that courage knows no tribe." The firelight caught the angles of his face as he added quietly, "And because you fought to live when others would have surrendered." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that transcended the barriers of language and culture and history. Ellie felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire's heat, an unexpected connection to this man whose world was so different from her own. Sleep came more easily that night than it had since the attack. Despite the hard ground and the lingering chill, Ellie felt safer than she had in days. When morning broke, bringing with it clear skies and birdsong, she awakened to find Windrunner already preparing for their departure. "The river is not far," he said when he noticed she was awake. "We can reach it by midday if we move quickly." They set out. As the sun crested the eastern hills, the landscape transformed by the previous day's storm. What had been parched and dusty was now vibrant with temporary life. Wildflowers opening their faces to the morning light, small streams cutting new paths through ancient stone. Ellie's borrowed buckskin shirt had dried overnight, though her dress remained damp and unsuitable for the journey. By unspoken agreement, she continued to wear Windrunner's garment, her own dress carefully folded and tucked into the small bundle she carried. As they walked, Windrunner pointed out plants and their uses, which berries were safe to eat, which leaves could be brewed for medicine, which roots held precious water. Ellie absorbed the knowledge eagerly, recognizing its value for survival in this unforgiving land. "You learn quickly," he observed after she correctly identified a plant he had shown her earlier. "I was always a good student," she replied with a small smile. "That's partly why I became a teacher." Windrunner considered this. "In my tribe, the best hunters teach the young ones. Those who know must share their knowledge." "It's similar among my people," Ellie said, "though we separate knowledge into subjects. Reading, mathematics, history." "Strange way to learn," Windrunner commented. "The world is not separated into pieces." The observation was so similar to thoughts Ellie had harbored during her own education that she laughed in surprise. "I've often thought the same thing," she admitted, "but it's difficult to teach children everything at once." "Not if you let the land be the teacher," Windrunner countered. "A single hunt teaches tracking, weather, plants, animals, respect." Before Ellie could respond, Windrunner suddenly froze, raising one hand to signal silence. He tilted his head slightly, listening to something beyond her perception. Then, without explanation, he grasped her arm and pulled her behind a large boulder. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart immediately racing. "Riders," he murmured, his body tense as a drawn bowstring, coming from the east. Ellie strained to hear what had alerted him, but it was several long seconds before she detected the faint sound of hoofbeats. Whoever approached was still some distance away, yet Windrunner had sensed their presence with uncanny precision. "Soldiers?" she asked, remembering his story about his sister. He shook his head. "Too few. 3, maybe 4. His expression darkened. "Comanche." The significance of this wasn't immediately apparent to Ellie. "Your people," she said. "Isn't that good?" Windrunner's grip on her arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "Not all Comanche would understand why I help you." The implication was clear. Just as some settlers would view Windrunner as an enemy regardless of his actions, some of his own people would see his assistance to a white woman as betrayal. They were caught between worlds, neither fully safe in one or the other. "What do we do?" Ellie asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Windrunner scanned their surroundings, calculating. "We cannot outrun mounted warriors," he said finally. "We hide. Let them pass." He led her deeper into a cluster of boulders, to a narrow crevice barely visible among the shadows. It was a tight fit for both of them, requiring them to press. Close together, their breathing synced by necessity. Ellie could feel the steady beat of Windrunner's heart against her shoulder, the controlled tension in his body as he listened for the approaching riders. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied, now by voices speaking in a language Ellie couldn't understand. The Comanche riders were close, perhaps passing directly by the boulder formation that concealed them. Windrunner's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his muscles coiled and ready. One voice rose above the others, calling out a name that made Windrunner flinch slightly. "Wakaria." The call came again, closer this time. "They search for you," Ellie whispered, barely audible. Windrunner nodded once, his jaw set in a hard line. They were looking for him specifically, not simply passing through the area. How they had known to search here or why remained a mystery that Ellie suspected she wouldn't like the answer to. The voice called out again, followed by what sounded like a question. Windrunner remained motionless, though Ellie could sense his internal struggle. These were his people, perhaps even friends or family members. His disappearance would have been noted, particularly after he failed to return with news of the outlaws. He had been tracking. For several agonizing minutes, they remained hidden as the riders circled the area, occasionally calling out. Then, gradually, the voices and hoofbeats receded. Windrunner waited far longer than Ellie would have dared before finally easing out of their hiding place, his movements cautious and deliberate as he scanned the horizon. "They're gone?" Ellie asked, emerging behind him. "For now." His expression was troubled. "They ride toward the river, the same direction we travel." Ellie understood the problem immediately. "They'll reach the crossing before us." Windrunner nodded grimly. "And likely wait there. It is the most logical place to search." "Who were they? Why are they looking for you?" He hesitated before answering. "The leader's voice. I know it. Stonewolf, my cousin." His mouth tightened. "We have disagreements about many things." The way he said it suggested these disagreements were significant enough to make their current situation potentially dangerous. Ellie remembered the story of his sister, his comment about not being fully accepted by his tribe. Whatever rift existed between Windrunner and this stone wolf, it clearly ran deep. "What will we do now?" she asked. Windrunner considered their options, his gaze moving from the eastern horizon to the hills behind them. "There is another crossing," he said finally. 2 days south, rarely used because of the rapids." "Is it dangerous?" "Yes." He didn't elaborate, but his expression said enough. The alternative crossing would be a significant risk, but perhaps less of one than encountering Stonewolf and his search party. "Then we go south," Ellie said, with more confidence than she felt. Windrunner studied her face, seeming to measure her resolve. "It will not be an easy journey." "None of this has been easy," she replied simply. "But I'm still here." That earned her a brief flash of something almost like a smile, a slight softening around his eyes, a momentary easing of the tension in his features. Without further discussion, he adjusted their course, leading them away from the direct path to the river and toward the southern hills. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as the day progressed. What had been rolling grassland gave way to rocky outcroppings and steep ravines that forced them to backtrack frequently. The October sun beat down relentlessly, and despite the previous day's rain, water was scarce in this higher elevation. By late afternoon, Ellie's strength was flagging. The wound on her shoulder, though healing, still sapped her energy, and the constant climbing had left her legs trembling with exhaustion. She stumbled on a loose stone, barely catching herself before falling. Windrunner paused, looking back at her with an unreadable expression. "We rest," he declared, his tone brooking no argument. Ellie wanted to protest that she could continue, but the relief that flooded through her at his words was too overwhelming to deny. They found shelter beneath a small overhang, and Windrunner disappeared briefly before returning with a small desert hare he had somehow managed to catch during his brief absence. As night fell and they shared the meager meal, Ellie found herself wondering about the life Windrunner had left behind to escort her to safety. "Will you be able to return to your people?" she asked. After she let the question trail off, but he understood her meaning. "I do not know," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the small fire between them. "Stone Wolf has the ear of our chief. If he speaks against me, because you helped me, Windy." Runner shook his head slightly. "This is only the most recent disagreement. There have been many." He was silent for a moment before adding, "Stone Wolf believes all white settlers should be driven from our hunting grounds. I believe some form of peace is possible." It was the most he had spoken of tribal politics, and Ellie sensed the topic was difficult for him. "And that makes you an outsider among your own people." "To some," he acknowledged, "not all. But Stone Wolf's voice grows louder each season." Ellie considered this, recognizing the parallel to divisions among her own people, those who advocated for coexistence versus those who called for the extermination or removal of all native tribes. Neither side seemed capable of truly seeing the other as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. "What will you do if you can't return?" she asked softly. Windrunner's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his dark eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a grief he wouldn't allow himself to fully feel. "I will find a new path," he said simply. The words hung between them, laden with unspoken questions about what such a new path might entail, and whether it could possibly intersect with her own uncertain future. But Ellie didn't dare pursue the thought further. Instead, she pulled Windrunner's borrowed buckskin shirt more tightly around herself and settled down to sleep, her dreams troubled by images of riders searching endlessly across an infinite prairie. They set out at first light, Windrunner setting a pace that suggested urgency without quite crossing into recklessness. The southern river crossing, he explained as they walked, lay at the bottom of a steep canyon where the water narrowed and quickened before spilling into rapids beyond. Few attempted the crossing because of the dangerous currents, but a skilled swimmer could navigate the calmer pool just before the rapids. "Can you swim?" he asked Ellie, the question clearly important. "Yes," she assured him. "My father insisted all his children learn. Our home in Boston was near the harbor." Windrunner nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. When we reach the crossing, you must follow my lead exactly. The current is strong, but the danger is mostly beyond the crossing point." By midday, the terrain had changed dramatically. The hills gave way to a rocky plateau, split by a deep canyon, carved over millennia by the same river they sought to cross. Windrunner led them along the rim, searching for a specific point where the descent would be manageable. "There," he said finally, pointing to a narrow trail that zigzagged down the canyon wall. "We go down here." The path was treacherous, little more than a game trail in places, forcing them to scramble down steep sections using hands and feet alike. Ellie's wounded shoulder protested each time she had to grip a rock or root for stability, but she kept pace with Windrunner, determined not to become the burden he had initially feared she would be. As they neared the canyon floor, the roar of water grew louder, reverberating off the stone walls surrounding them. The river here was a living thing, powerful and untamed as it carved its eternal path through the landscape. Ellie felt a flutter of apprehension as they finally reached the bank, and she saw the crossing point Windrunner had described. The water was indeed calmer here than in the visible rapids downstream, but calm was a relative term. The current moved swiftly, the yard surface rippling with hidden power. On the far bank, perhaps 40 yards away, the canyon wall rose less steeply than on their side, offering a more manageable climb back to the plateau. "We cross together," Windrunner said, studying the water's flow. "Link arms. Do not let go, no matter what happens." Ellie nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. Windrunner removed his minimal gear, securing it in a tight bundle that he tied to his back. Ellie did the same with her small pack, reluctantly including her damp dress, which would only weigh her down in the water. When they were ready, Windrunner extended his arm. Ellie linked hers through it, feeling the solid strength of his grip as their forearms locked together. Without further discussion, he led them into the river. The cold hit Ellie like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. October in the Texas Hill Country was mild by northern standards, but the river carried the chill of mountain, snowmelt from far upstream. She gasped, her body instinctively trying to retreat from the shock, but Windrunner's arm held her steady. "Keep moving," he urged as they waded deeper, the water rising past their waists. "The cold will pass." When the riverbed dropped away beneath their feet, they began to swim in tandem, Windrunner's powerful strokes compensating for Ellie's weaker ones. The current grabbed at them immediately, trying to pull them downstream toward the rapids, but Windrunner angled their trajectory upstream, fighting the river's power with grim determination. For a moment, Ellie believed they would make it without incident. They had reached the midpoint of the crossing, their linked arms still secure, their progress steady, if slow. Then her foot struck something beneath the surface, a submerged branch or rock, sending a jolt of pain up her leg. She faltered, missing a stroke, and the current seized the opportunity. In an instant, they were pulled several yards downstream, closer to the point where the river's relatively calm surface gave way to white water. Ellie heard Windrunner's sharp intake of breath, felt his arm tighten around hers as he redoubled his efforts against the current. "Kick harder!" he shouted above the roar of the water. "We must move upstream!" Ellie fought against the panic rising in her chest, forcing her legs to keep moving despite the pain in her right calf. They made incremental progress back toward their intended crossing point, but the effort was exhausting them both. Windrunner's breathing had grown labored, and Ellie's wounded shoulder screamed in protest with each stroke. When her arm slipped slightly in Windrunner's grip, she saw genuine fear flash across his face for the first time since she'd met him. "Hold on!" he commanded, his fingers digging into her forearm with bruising force. "I'm trying!" she gasped, as water splashed into her mouth. They were being carried inexorably toward the rapids now, their combined strength no match for the river's power. In a desperate gamble, Windrunner changed tactics, ceasing to fight upstream and instead angling directly for the far bank. It meant they would emerge dangerously close to the rapids, but it was their only chance to cross before being swept away entirely. The current helped them now, adding its force to their strokes as they cut diagonally across the river. The far bank approached more quickly, but so did the line of white water marking the beginning of the rapids. It would be a race, one measured in heartbeats rather than minutes. Ellie's lungs burned, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, but she matched Windrunner's pace, stroke for stroke. 10 yards from shore, 5. The roar of the rapids grew deafening as they closed in from behind. Windrunner's feet found purchase, on the riverbed first. With a surge of strength that seemed impossible after their ordeal, he half dragged, half carried Ellie the final distance to the bank. They collapsed together on the rocky shore, the deadly white water churning just yards away, their chests heaving as they gulped air into starved lungs. For several minutes neither spoke, too exhausted to do more than breathe and feel the blessed solidity of land beneath them. Ellie's entire body ached, her wounded shoulder throbbing in time with her racing heart. Beside her, Windrunner lay equally spent, water streaming from his long hair across features etched with fatigue. "We made it," Ellie finally managed, her voice barely audible above the river's constant roar. Windrunner turned his head to look at her, droplets clinging to his eyelashes as he blinked away water. For the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, a brief, unexpected expression that transformed his face completely. "Yes," he agreed. "Simply, we made it." The moments stretched between them, a shared victory against overwhelming odds that neither needed to articulate further. Then, with visible effort, Windrunner pushed himself to a sitting position, wincing slightly as he moved. "Are you hurt?" Ellie asked, noticing the grimace. "It is nothing," he dismissed, but she saw how he favored his left side as he stood. "Let me see," she insisted, rising despite her own exhaustion. Windrunner started to refuse, but relented when Ellie fixed him with a stubborn glare. A jagged cut ran along his ribs on the right side, likely from striking a rock during their crossing. It wasn't deep, but in these conditions, even minor wounds could become dangerous if infected. "We need to clean and bind that," Ellie said, her teacher's authoritative tone returning instinctively. To her surprise, Windrunner didn't argue. He allowed her to examine the wound more closely, standing with stoic stillness as she used water from the river's edge to clean away the blood. When she had finished, she tore a strip from the bottom of her already ruined dress to bind the cut. "Now we're even," she said as she tied off the makeshift bandage. "You tended my wounds, and I've tended yours." Windrunner inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the reciprocity between them. "We should move," he said, gesturing toward the canyon rim above them. "The climb will be easier here, but still difficult." Ellie followed his gaze up the steep slope. "How far to the trading post once we reach the top?" "Half a day's walk," Windrunner replied. "We will reach it by tomorrow evening." Tomorrow evening. The words filled Ellie with a strange mixture of relief and trepidation. The trading post represented safety, the end of this dangerous journey through the wilderness. But it also meant parting ways with Windrunner, stepping back into a world that, while more familiar, now seemed somehow less real than the days she had spent in his company. The climb from the canyon proved less treacherous than the descent had been on the opposite side. Though still challenging for their exhausted bodies, by the time they reached the plateau, the sun was lowering toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. They made camp in the shelter of a limestone outcropping. Too tired to continue further that day, their supplies were sodden from the river crossing, the tinder too wet to easily catch fire. Windrunner disappeared briefly and returned with a handful of dry moss and small twigs he had somehow located in this seemingly barren terrain. His skill with fire starting was remarkable. Within minutes, a small flame had caught and begun to grow into a serviceable campfire. As they huddled near the warmth, their clothes and hair gradually drying in the heat, Ellie found herself reluctant to break the companionable silence between them. Tomorrow would bring change, an ending to this unexpected chapter of her life. Questions about what would follow remained unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. "What will you do?" she finally asked, echoing the question he had posed to her days earlier. "After we reach the trading post." Windrunner stared into the flames, his expression contemplative. "I do not know," he admitted. "Return to my people and face Stone Wolf's accusations, or..." He left the alternative unspoken, but Ellie heard it nonetheless. "Or choose that new path he had mentioned, one that led away from his tribe, from the only life he had known." "Could you stay?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could consider its implications. "At the trading post, I mean. You said yourself it's a place between worlds." "I could," he acknowledged, his tone neutral. "Many Comanche work there as guides, or hunters." He paused, adding quietly, "But it is not a life I had envisioned for myself." "Neither is teaching at a trading post the life I had envisioned," Ellie pointed out. "Sometimes the path chooses us, rather than the other way around." Windrunner glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. "Yes," he agreed. "Sometimes it does." The night deepened around them, stars appearing in the vast Texas sky like countless watchful eyes. Ellie found herself memorizing the moment, the crackle of the fire, the silhouette of Windrunner against the darkness, the strange peace she felt despite everything that had happened and all that remained uncertain. When morning came, bringing with it the final leg of their journey, they packed their meager belongings in silence. The trading post lay ahead, invisible beyond the horizon, but drawing them forward with the promise of civilization, however rough and frontier-like it might be. The journey across the plateau took them through terrain, unlike anything Ellie had encountered before. A landscape of weathered stone and hardy vegetation that seemed to exist in defiance of the elements, rather than in harmony with them. Windrunner moved with practiced ease over the uneven ground, occasionally pointing out signs that meant nothing to Ellie's untrained eye. A displaced stone, bent grass, the faint impression of a hoof mark in hardened soil. "Stone Wolf and his warriors passed this way," he said, crouching to examine what appeared to be ordinary dust to Ellie. "Yesterday, after the rain." "How can you tell?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Windrunner indicated a nearly invisible depression. "The track is still clear, but beginning to soften at the edges. Not fresh, but recent." He straightened, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. They rode east, toward the trading post. Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Will they wait for us there?" "Perhaps." Windrunner's jaw tightened. "Stone Wolf is stubborn, like his name." "We could avoid the trading post," Ellie suggested, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the impracticality of the idea. Without supplies, without clear direction, attempting to travel elsewhere through this unforgiving country would be foolhardy at best, suicidal at worst. Windrunner seemed to follow her thoughts. "The trading post is your best chance," he said, firmly. "There is food, shelter, people who speak your language." He paused before adding, "I will ensure you arrive safely." "And then?" "Abduit." He did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, as if he could see beyond it to the confrontation that awaited. "And then I will face what comes." They continued their journey in silence, each lost in private thoughts. The plateau gradually gave way to rolling hills covered in scrubby juniper and mesquite. In the distance, the land dropped away to a broad valley where the river they had crossed meandered lazily, its violent character from the canyon transformed into something deceptively serene. By midday, Windrunner paused atop a ridge, gesturing toward a thin line of smoke rising from the valley below. "The trading post," he said. "We will reach it before sundown." From this distance, the settlement appeared underwhelming. A collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around what Ellie presumed was the main trading house. A corral held horses and mules, and a few smaller structures were scattered at a slight remove, suggesting the beginnings of a proper town rather than merely a commercial outpost. As they began their descent into the valley, Ellie found herself studying Windrunner's profile, memorizing the sharp lines of his face, the watchful intensity of his eyes. She had known him for less than a week, yet in that brief span, he had transformed from enemy to rescuer to something she had no name for, something that existed in the uncharted territory between cultures, between worlds. "Windrunner," she said, breaking the lengthy silence between them. "I wish..." What she wished exactly, she couldn't articulate. That circumstances were different, that the complications of their respective worlds didn't stand between them, that the brief, intense connection forged in survival might have opportunity to grow in more peaceful times. He turned to her, something in his expression suggesting he understood her unfinished thought. "I know," he said simply. A sudden sound from the valley below interrupted the moment. hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Windrunner reacted instantly, pulling Ellie behind the cover of a large boulder as 4 riders appeared on the trail below them. 3 were clearly Comanche warriors, their hair styled in the distinctive fashion of the tribe. The 4th was a white man dressed in the practical garb of a frontiersman, leading the group toward their position. "Stone Wolf," Windrunner murmured, his body tensing as he recognized the lead rider. Ellie peered cautiously around the boulder. The warrior called Stone Wolf sat tall in his saddle, his bearing imperious as he surveyed the surrounding landscape. Even at this distance, the resemblance to Windrunner was evident. The same high cheekbones and proud profile, though Stone Wolf's expression held none of the quiet thoughtfulness she had come to associate with his cousin. "And the white man?" "Ooh," she whispered. "Trader," Windrunner replied, his voice tight with tension. "Jackson. He deals with both settlers and Comanche." The riders paused almost directly below their hiding place, Stone Wolf raising a hand to halt the party. For one heart-stopping moment, Ellie feared they had been discovered. But the Comanche leader merely turned to the trader, engaging in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Though too distant to hear their words clearly, the aggressive gestures and raised voices suggested disagreement. Finally, Stone Wolf made a sharp, dismissive gesture, wheeling his horse around to continue up the trail, directly toward where Ellie and Windrunner concealed themselves. The other warriors followed, but the trader remained behind, watching their departure with a troubled expression before turning his mount back toward the trading post. "They come this way," Ellie hissed, panic rising in her chest. Windrunner assessed their options with quick efficiency. "We cannot outrun them on foot," he said, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "And we cannot hide here. They will see our tracks. Then what do we do?" His eyes met hers, dark and resolute. "I face my cousin. You stay hidden." "No," Ellie protested immediately. "I won't let you face them alone. This is not your fight." "You made it my fight when you saved my life," she countered, her voice low but fierce. "Besides, they're looking for both of us now. Stone Wolf knows you travel with a white woman." Windrunner's expression suggested he wanted to argue further, but the approaching hoofbeats left no time for debate. "Stay behind me," he said finally, stepping out from behind the boulder to stand in the middle of the trail, his posture relaxed but watchful. Ellie moved to his side instead, ignoring his sharp look of disapproval. If they were to face this confrontation, they would do so together, as they had faced the river, the outlaws, and everything else the past days had thrown at them. Stone Wolf reined his horse to an abrupt halt as they came into view, his companions following suit. For a long moment, silence hung between the mounted warriors and the pair standing defiant on the trail. Then Stone Wolf spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "Wakaria," he said, using Windrunner's Comanche name, "you dishonor your people." Windrunner's expression remained impassive. "I have brought no dishonor to our tribe, Stone Wolf. I tracked and killed the raiders who threatened our hunting grounds. And then took a white woman as your companion." Stone Wolf's gaze shifted to Ellie, his eyes cold with disdain. "The council awaits your return to pass judgment." "There is no law against helping those in need," Windrunner replied evenly. "She is a survivor of the raid, nothing more." Stone Wolf's laugh was devoid of humor. "Nothing more? You risk your life to escort her to the trading post. You defy your own kin to protect her." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice hardening. "Do you think me blind, cousin? Do you think I cannot see the truth?" "The truth," Windrunner said, "is that I honor our ancestors by showing courage and compassion, as they taught us to do." "Compassion?" Stone Wolf spat the word like a curse. "For the people who steal our land, who kill our buffalo, who drive us from the hunting grounds of our fathers." His gaze returned to Ellie, contempt evident in every line of his face. "She is the enemy, Wakaria. Her kind will destroy us all. Ellie felt Windrunner tense beside her, though his expression betrayed nothing. She has done no harm to our people, he said. She is a teacher, not a soldier. She teaches their children to despise us, Stonewolf countered. To fear us. To hate us. No, Ellie said, unable to remain silent any longer. I teach children to read, to calculate, to understand the world around them. She met Stonewolf's hostile gaze directly. I have never taught hatred. Stonewolf's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his intent clear in the gesture. Your words mean nothing, white woman. Enough. Windrunner stepped forward, placing himself more firmly between Ellie and his cousin. She is under my protection, Stonewolf. By right of life debt, she is untouchable. The declaration seemed to carry significant weight, for Stonewolf's hand froze at his belt, his expression flickering with uncertainty for the first time. The other warriors exchanged glances, clearly understanding some cultural implication that eluded Ellie. Life debt? Stonewolf repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. You claim she saved your life? At the canyon, Windrunner confirmed. The outlaws had me surrounded. She created a diversion that allowed me to defeat them. He held his cousin's gaze steadily. Without her, I would have died. The debt is real. Stonewolf's jaw clenched visibly as he considered this new information. Life debt was clearly a serious matter among the Comanche, perhaps even sacred enough to override Stonewolf's obvious hatred for settlers. The council will still demand your return, he said finally, and they will question this debt. I will return, Windrunner agreed, after I've fulfilled my obligation by seeing her safely to the trading post. A tense silence followed as Stonewolf weighed his options. The other warriors watched him closely, awaiting his decision. Ellie held her breath, acutely aware that their lives hung in the balance of this man's pride and prejudice. Finally, Stonewolf jerked his chin in a curt nod. Very well, complete your obligation, cousin, but know this. I will be waiting when you return to face judgment. His gaze shifted to Ellie once more, cold as winter frost. And you, white woman, do not mistake this reprieve for acceptance. Were it not for our laws regarding life debt, your blood would stain this ground. With that ominous pronouncement, he wheeled his horse around and galloped back down the trail, his warriors close behind. The sound of their passage faded gradually, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. Ellie released the breath she'd been holding, her hands trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. Life debt? She questioned quietly. Is that real? Windrunner's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the tension didn't leave his face entirely. Yes, among our people, saving a life creates a sacred bond. The rescued owes protection to the rescuer. He glanced at her, adding, It was not a lie. You did save my life at the canyon. But you saved mine first, Ellie pointed out. At the river. True. A hint of something almost like humor touched his expression. Perhaps we are bound in both directions. The implications of such mutual obligation hung unspoken between them as they resumed their journey toward the trading post. The encounter with Stonewolf had changed something, though Ellie couldn't quite define what. There was a new weight to their interactions, a sense of connection that transcended their immediate circumstances. As the afternoon waned, the trading post grew larger in their vision, its crude architecture resolving into clearer detail. The main building was constructed of roughly hewn logs, with a tin roof that gleamed dully in the fading sunlight. Smaller structures, some proper buildings, others little more than lean-tos, surrounded it in haphazard fashion. A wooden sign, weathered by sun and rain, proclaimed Brazos Trading Company in faded lettering. A dozen or so people moved about, the grounds, their activities pausing momentarily as they noticed the approach of the unusual pair. a Comanche warrior, and a white woman in borrowed buckskin. Ellie felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions in their expressions, as they drew closer. Near the corral, the trader they had seen earlier, Jackson, was dismounting from his horse. He turned at their approach, surprise evident in his weathered features. "Well, now," he said, his voice carrying a hint of southern drawl. "Wasn't expecting to see you two walking in together." His gaze moved between them, calculating but not overtly hostile. "Stone Wolf seemed mighty interested in finding you." Windrunner inclined his head slightly but offered no explanation. Jackson seemed to accept this reticence, turning his attention to Ellie instead. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of frontier courtesy. "Thomas Jackson, proprietor of this establishment. You look like you've had a rough journey." "Eleanor Mitchell," she replied, mustering what dignity she could in her disheveled state. "I was traveling with the Dry Creek expedition when we were attacked. I'm the only survivor, or at least the only one who didn't abandon the others." Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes. "The wagon train bound for Fort Davis? Heard about that. Outlaws hit it hard from what my scouts reported." He shook his head grimly. "Been meaning to send someone to check for survivors, but with tensions running high." He glanced at Windrunner. "Seems you found help elsewhere." "Windrunner saved my life," Ellie said simply, "multiple times." Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly at her use of the warrior's English name, but he merely nodded. "Well, you're safe now, Miss Mitchell. We've got a room you can use. Belongs to the doctor's wife when she visits, but she ain't here now, and I reckon we can find some proper clothes to replace that." He gestured vaguely at her attire, clearly uncertain how to politely reference her wearing of Comanche buckskin. "Thank you," Ellie said. "I have no money, but I'm willing to work. I was hired as a teacher for the Fort Davis settlement." "A teacher, eh?" Jackson seemed intrigued by this information. "Could use one of those around here. Got a dozen children or so. Mixed bunch, settlers' kids and half Comanche. No formal schooling to speak of." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Might be able to work something out if you're interested." The offer, casual as it was, represented exactly what Ellie had hoped for, a chance to rebuild some semblance of the life she had planned before the attack. Yet she found herself unable to fully embrace the opportunity, her awareness of Windrunner's silent presence beside her creating a strange reluctance. "I'd like to discuss it," she said carefully, "after I've had a chance to rest and consider my options." Jackson nodded, seemingly understanding more than she had explicitly stated. "Of course. Take your time." He turned to Windrunner. "You staying or heading back to your people?" The question hung heavy in the air between them. Ellie held her breath, not daring to look at Windrunner as he considered his response. "I will stay tonight," he said finally, "to ensure she is truly safe." Jackson accepted this with a pragmatic nod. "Can give you space in the storage room. Not fancy, but private enough. Stone Wolf and his boys are camped outside town. Figure you'd rather not bunk too close to them." "Thank you," Windrunner said simply. As Jackson led them toward the main building, Ellie was acutely conscious of the stairs following there. In progress, the trading post's inhabitants, a mix of rough frontiersmen, a few women in practical frontier dress, and several Comanche and Mexican workers, watched with undisguised curiosity. She heard whispers in multiple languages, catching fragments that suggested speculation about her relationship with Windrunner. The interior of the trading post was dim after the bright afternoon light, the air heavy with the sense of tobacco, leather, and dried goods. Jackson navigated them past shelves stocked with supplies and trade items toward a narrow staircase at the rear of the building. "Doctor's wife's room is upstairs," he told Ellie. "Got a wash basin and privacy screen. My wife, Martha, can help. You get settled, find you some clothes and such." He gestured to a woman who had appeared at the sound of their entrance, her careworn face lined with the hardships of frontier life, but her eyes kind as she assessed Ellie's condition. "Come along, dear," Martha said, her voice gentle but brooking no argument. "You look dead on your feet. A hot meal and clean clothes will do wonders." Ellie hesitated, glancing at Windrunner. They had not been separated since he had pulled her from the floodwaters, and the prospect of parting, even temporarily, felt strangely significant. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable to others, but containing a message she had learned to interpret. "Go," he said quietly. "Rest. I will be here." Martha led Ellie upstairs to a small but clean room furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a washstand. True to Jackson's word, a privacy screen stood in one corner and a window overlooked the small settlement, offering a view of the surrounding countryside. "Poor thing," Martha clucked sympathetically as she helped Ellie. "Remove Windrunner's borrowed buckskin shirt. Look at you, all skin and bones, and that shoulder still healing." She examined the wound with practiced efficiency. "Bullet graze? From the attack, I suppose." Ellie nodded, suddenly too exhausted to explain further. The events of the past days crashed over her in a wave of delayed reaction now that she had reached relative safety. Martha seemed to understand, filling a basin with water from a pitcher and providing a cloth for washing. "You clean up, dear. I'll fetch some proper clothes and something to eat." At the door, she paused, her expression softening further. "That Comanche, Windrunner, is it? He seems different from the others." "He is," Ellie confirmed simply. Martha nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Rest now. We'll talk more when you've had a chance to recover." Left alone, Ellie sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of being in a proper room again after days in the wilderness. The basin of water beckoned, promising cleanliness she had nearly forgotten was possible. She washed slowly, wincing as the cloth passed over cuts and bruises accumulated during her ordeal. As the grime of travel was gradually removed, Ellie found herself studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The face that looked back was almost a stranger's, thinner, certainly, with new lines of strain around the eyes, but also carrying a hardness that hadn't been there before. The sheltered schoolteacher from Boston had been transformed by fire and flood and fear into someone stronger, someone who had faced death and survived. Martha returned with clothing, a simple calico dress, undergarments and sturdy boots that were slightly too large but serviceable. "These belong to my daughter," she explained as she helped Ellie dress. "She married a cattle rancher last spring and moved farther west. I've been saving them, but you need them more than my hope chest does." The kindness of this gesture, from a stranger who had nothing to gain from it, brought unexpected tears to Ellie's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll find a way to repay you." "Nonsense," Martha waved away the offer. "We all help each other out here on the frontier. It's the only way to survive." She sat Ellie at the small table by the window, placing a tray of food before her, stew, cornbread and coffee that smelled better than anything Ellie could remember. "Eat," Martha encouraged, "then sleep. Everything else can wait until morning." The stew was simple but delicious, the first proper meal Ellie had eaten since the attack. She found herself eating ravenously, barely pausing between bites until her body reminded her that too much too quickly would only make her ill. She forced herself to slow down, savoring each mouthful as Martha busied herself with tidying the room. "Your Comanche friend," Martha said casually as she worked. "Thomas says he's staying the night." Ellie nodded, uncertain how to explain Windrunner's presence or his decision to remain at the trading post. We... Martha patted her hand gently. "No need to explain, dear. I've been on this frontier for 20 years. Seen all sorts of arrangements between all sorts of people." Her expression grew serious. "But I should warn you, not everyone is as understanding as Thomas and me. Some folks here, they've lost family to Comanche raids. They won't take kindly to whatever is between you two." "There's nothing," Ellie began automatically, then stopped herself. Was that true? Could the intense connection forged between them in survival be dismissed as nothing? Martha's knowing smile suggested she saw through the denial. "As I said, no need to explain. Just be careful, is all I'm saying." She gathered the empty dishes onto the tray. "Now get some sleep. You look ready to drop where you sit." After Martha departed, Ellie moved to the window, gazing out at the trading post as twilight descended. Lamps were being lit in windows, creating pools of golden light against the gathering darkness. Near the corral, she could make out windrunners. Distinctive silhouette as he cared for a horse, likely arranging for transportation back to his people when the time came. When the time came. The thought sent an unexpected pang through her chest. Their paths had crossed through violence and necessity. There was no logical reason to expect them to remain intertwined now that safety had been reached. Windrunner had obligations to his tribe, complicated as those might be, and she had the opportunity to build a new life here, teaching the children Martha had mentioned. Yet as she watched him move with that characteristic grace and precision, Ellie couldn't ignore the hollow feeling that accompanied thoughts of his departure. In less than a week, this man had become more important to her than reason could justify, a fixed point in the chaos her life had become, a presence that somehow made sense amid senselessness. Exhaustion finally overcame contemplation, and Ellie surrendered to the siren call of the narrow bed. The softness of an actual mattress felt strange after nights on hard ground, but her body's need for rest overwhelmed any discomfort from the transition. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost instantly. Morning arrived with the sounds of the trading post coming to life. Horses being fed in the corral, traders calling to one another, the clatter of goods being unloaded from a newly arrived wagon. Ellie awakened slowly, momentarily disoriented by her surroundings until memory reasserted itself. She rose and dressed quickly, eager to find Windrunner and confirm he had indeed remained as promised. The main room of the trading post was already busy when she descended the stairs. Frontiersmen and local workers gathered around a long table where Martha served breakfast from a massive iron pot. Jackson nodded a greeting from behind the counter where he was negotiating with a trapper over a stack of animal pelts. "Miss Mitchell, sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Ellie replied, her eyes scanning the room. "Is Windrunner?" "Outside." Jackson tilted his head toward the door. "Been up since before dawn, helping my stable boy with the horses. Man knows his way around animals, I'll say that for him." Relief washed through her, though she tried not to let it show too plainly on her face. "Thank you," Martha intercepted her before she could reach the door, pressing a mug of coffee and a plate of cornbread into her hands. "Eat first," she insisted. "Man or no man, you need your strength." Ellie accepted the food gratefully, consuming it quickly before heading outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hint of true autumn chill. At the corral, Windrunner was visible, instructing a young boy, presumably Jackson's stable, and on the proper way to approach a nervous Mustang that pawed at the ground with evident distrust. She paused to watch, struck by the patience in Windrunner's movements, the careful way he demonstrated each step for the wide-eyed boy. It was a side of him she hadn't fully seen before, the teacher rather than the warrior or hunter. The boy nodded enthusiastically at whatever Windrunner was explaining, clearly enraptured by this opportunity to learn from a Comanche horseman. Windrunner sensed her presence before she announced it, turning to meet her gaze across the yard. Something flickered in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement of her presence. He said something to the boy, who nodded again before turning his attention back to the Mustang. "You slept well?" Windrunner asked as he approached, his English more formal in this public setting than it had been during their days alone. "Yes," Ellie confirmed. "Better than I have in days." She hesitated, then added, "I wasn't sure you'd still be here. I said I would stay." His tone suggested the matter was simple, a promise made and therefore kept. "I know, but—" Ellie stopped, uncertain how to express the fear that had lingered despite his assurance. "Stonewolf is still near. I thought you might have decided it was safer to leave during the night." Windrunner's expression hardened, slightly at the mention of his cousin. "I do not fear Stonewolf." "Perhaps you should," a new voice interjected. "He's been telling anyone who'll listen that you've betrayed your people." They turned to find Jackson approaching, his expression, grim as he joined their conversation. "Came by at first light, demanding to know if you were still here. Wouldn't say what he plans, but it didn't sound friendly." Windrunner absorbed this information with outward calm, though Ellie noted the slight tension that appeared in his shoulders. "What did you tell him?" "That it wasn't his business who stays at my trading post," Jackson replied. "Didn't take kindly to that, I can tell you." He glanced between them, concern evident in his weathered features. "Look, I don't know what's between you two, and I don't much care. But things are tense enough between settlers and Comanche without adding personal feuds to the mix." "This is not a simple feud," Windrunner said quietly. "Stonewolf seeks to drive all settlers from Comanche lands, by force, if necessary." Jackson's frown deepened. "Been afraid of that. He's been gathering warriors, buying more ammunition than usual." He turned to Ellie. "Miss Mitchell, I meant what I said yesterday about teaching. We need someone like you here, especially with tensions rising. Children need to learn, war or no war." The offer was generous, particularly given her circumstances. A position at the trading post would provide shelter, food, and purpose, everything she had hoped to find when she'd set out for Fort Davis. It was the logical choice, the practical path forward from the ashes of her former plans. Yet Ellie found herself hesitating, her gaze drawn to Windrunner's impassive face. "What about you?" she asked him directly. "Will you return to your people?" Something unreadable passed behind his dark eyes. "I must face the council," he said finally, "explain my actions, even knowing Stonewolf has poisoned them against you." Windrunner's jaw tightened. "They are my people. I cannot abandon them to Stonewolf's hatred." The nobility of this stance, his willingness to face judgment from a council potentially biased against him rather than abandon his tribal responsibilities, only deepened Ellie's admiration for him. Yet it also confirmed what she had already known. Their paths were diverging, drawn apart by the inexorable pull of their separate worlds. "I understand," she said softly. Then, turning to Jackson, she added with forced brightness, "I would be grateful for the teaching position, Mr. Jackson. When could I start?" "Immediately, if you're willing," Jackson replied. "We've got a small building set aside for schooling. Nothing fancy, but it'll serve. Martha can help you get what supplies." "We have." Windrunner watched this exchange in silence, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Jackson excused himself to attend to a newly arrived customer, they were left alone again, standing in the shadow of the corral fence with unspoken words hanging between them. "You will be safe here," Windrunner said finally, his tone suggesting he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Jackson is fair to both settlers and Comanche, and you will have purpose again." "Yes," Ellie agreed, though the prospect brought less joy than it should have. "The children need education, especially with tensions rising. Perhaps understanding can begin with them." Windrunner's expression softened slightly. "You still believe in peace between our peoples?" "I have to," she replied simply. "The alternative is too painful to contemplate." A moment of understanding passed between them, acknowledgement that whatever personal connection had formed during their journey existed against a backdrop of larger conflicts that neither could fully control. Individual bridges might be built, but the chasm between their worlds remained vast and treacherous. "When will you leave?" Ellie asked, the question emerging more abruptly than she'd intended. Windrunner glanced toward the hills beyond the trading post where Stone Wolf and his warriors presumably waited. "Today," he said quietly, "there is no purpose in delaying." Though she had expected this answer, the finality of it still struck Ellie with unexpected force. After days of constant companionship, of shared danger and mutual protection, the thought of Windrunner simply riding away seemed impossible to accept. "I wish," she began, then stopped herself. Wishes were childish things, remnants of the sheltered schoolteacher she had been before the attack. The woman she had become knew better than to indulge in futile hopes. But Windrunner completed her thought, his voice dropping so that only she could hear. "I know. I wish also." The simple acknowledgement of shared regret made something twist painfully in Ellie's chest. They stood in silence for a long moment, neither able to voice the complex emotions that had grown between them, nor willing to dismiss them with platitudes. "I'll watch you ride out," she said finally, "to say goodbye properly." Windrunner nodded, a gesture of acceptance and perhaps gratitude. "I must prepare," he said, indicating the stable where his few possessions waited. "Jackson has given me a horse in payment for work with the Mustang." "Of course." Ellie stepped back, physically enacting the emotional distance she would soon need to maintain. "I should speak with Martha about the school." They parted with a lingering look, both aware that their next meeting would be their last for the foreseeable future. Perhaps forever, given the dangers Windrunner would face. Upon returning to his people, Ellie forced herself to walk with measured steps toward the main building, refusing to give the curious onlookers the satisfaction of seeing her distress. Martha greeted her warmly, immediately launching into details about the makeshift school and the children who would be her pupils. Ellie listened with appropriate attentiveness, asking questions and offering suggestions while her mind remained partly fixed on the stable where Windrunner prepared for departure. "You care for him," Martha observed during a lull in their planning. It wasn't a question. Ellie didn't bother denying it. "Yes." Martha's weathered face showed neither judgment nor surprise. "Frontier changes people," she said simply. "Out. Here, old prejudices don't always survive. Too much danger, too much need for cooperation." She squeezed Ellie's hand gently, "But that doesn't make it easy." "No," Ellie agreed, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't express. The tightness around his eyes suggested he was less confident than his words implied, but Ellie did not challenge his optimism. Hope, however tenuous, was necessary in such dire circumstances. "I should go," she agreed reluctantly. "If I'm discovered here, it would endanger both you and us." Windrunner finished her thought. "Yes." He gestured toward where her bay mare had been prepared for departure, saddled and ready. "Gray Fox assigned a young warrior to guide you back to the main trail. He will ensure you travel safely away from the army's likely path." Ellie nodded, acutely aware that this might be their final parting. The circumstances allowed no time for private farewells, no opportunity to express the complex emotions that had grown between them. Around them, the camp continued its efficient dissolution, dozens of eyes potentially watching any interaction between the white schoolteacher and the Comanche leader. "Windrunner," she began, then faltered, uncertain what could possibly be said in such a moment. He seemed to understand, nevertheless. With careful deliberation, he withdrew something from a pouch at his waist, a small carving of what appeared to be an eagle, its wings outstretched in flight. The piece was expertly crafted from bone, smooth from handling, and stained a warm amber color from years of use. "This was my father's," he said quietly, pressing it into her palm. "It is said to protect travelers on difficult journeys." The significance of such a gift, a family heirloom entrusted to an outsider, was not lost on Ellie. She closed her fingers around the carving, feeling its weight and warmth as though it carried some essence of Windrunner himself. "I'll keep it safe," she promised, unable to find more adequate words for what the gesture meant to her. A young warrior approached, indicating with respectful gestures that he was ready to guide her back to the trail. The moment for farewell had arrived, inescapable and insufficient. "Be careful," Ellie said finally, the simple phrase laden with everything she couldn't express openly. Windrunner held her gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary, his dark eyes conveying what words could not. "Live well, Eleanor Mitchell," he replied formally, though his tone carried warmer undercurrents. "May your path be clear." With that traditional Comanche blessing, he stepped back, allowing her guide to assist her onto the mare. As Ellie settled into the saddle, she took one last look at the camp, at the people whose lives had become unexpectedly entwined with hers, at the man who had saved her from death only to face new dangers himself. Then, with a slight pressure of her heels, she directed the mare to follow her guide away from the camp, toward the uncertain safety of the trading post and the life she had begun to build there. The bone eagle pressed against her palm, carried now in the pocket of her riding skirt, seemed to pulse with a reassurance she desperately needed, but couldn't fully believe. The journey back proceeded with greater speed than her outward trip, her guide choosing paths that favored efficiency over concealment. The young warrior, Ellie guessed him to be no more than 16 or 17, maintained a vigilant watch for any sign of the approaching army, occasionally stopping to listen intently before signaling that they should continue. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the main trail when he suddenly raised his hand in a sharp gesture for silence. Ellie reined the mare to an immediate halt, her heart racing as she strained to hear whatever had alerted her companion. For several long moments, nothing disturbed the afternoon stillness save the soft rustling of dried grass in the autumn breeze. Then, distantly but unmistakably, came the rhythmic sound of horses moving at a steady trot, many horses approaching from the southeast. The army patrol, almost certainly, moving with the purposeful progression of men confident in their superior numbers and firepower. The young warrior's expression tightened as he calculated their position relative to the approaching soldiers. With quick, efficient gestures, he indicated that they should dismount and lead their horses into a nearby ravine that offered some concealment. Ellie complied without question, understanding the danger that discovery would pose to them both. From their hiding place among scrub oak and limestone outcroppings, they watched as the patrol came into view, a column of mounted soldiers in blue uniforms, rifles prominent across their saddles, faces set in the grim determination of men embarking on punitive action. At their head rode an officer whose bearing suggested long experience in frontier campaigns, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain as though reading signs invisible to ordinary observers. The patrol passed within 100 yards of their position, close enough that Ellie could hear fragments of conversation carried on the still air, complaints about the pace, speculation about the location of hostiles, casual dehumanization of the people they pursued. She felt her guide tense beside her at these words, though his face remained impassive, trained to hide emotion from potential enemies. Only when the last soldier had passed and the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance did the young warrior signal that it was safe to continue. They emerged cautiously from the ravine, remounting to resume their journey with increased urgency. The encounter had demonstrated how narrow the margin of safety had become. For Ellie, for her guide, and most critically, for Windrunner's people, attempting to reach the shelter of the caves before the army intercepted them. They reached the main trail by late afternoon, the young warrior bringing them to a halt at the fork where Ellie had turned off earlier that day. He gestured toward the path leading back to the trading post, then raised his hand in a formal farewell. "Thank you," Ellie said, knowing he might not understand her words, but hoping he would recognize her gratitude in her tone and expression. He inclined his head slightly, then turned his horse and disappeared back into the landscape with the silent efficiency that still impressed her despite her weeks on the frontier. Within moments, it was as though he had never been there at all, leaving Ellie alone to complete the final leg of her journey. The trading post came into view just as dusk was gathering, lamps being lit in windows as the community prepared for evening. Ellie urged the mare to a faster pace, aware that her unexplained day-long absence would have caused concern, particularly given the circumstances of her departure. Jackson emerged from the stables as she rode into the yard, relief evident in his weathered features. "Was beginning to think you weren't coming back," he said, taking the mare's reins as Ellie dismounted stiffly, her body protesting the long hours in the saddle. "I found them," she said simply, knowing Jackson would understand the significance of those 3 words. He nodded, leading the mare toward the stable. "Come inside first. Martha's been worried sick, and there's news you should hear before we talk further." The ominous tone of this last statement sent a chill through Ellie as she followed him toward the main building. Inside, Martha rushed to embrace her, maternal concern overriding any lingering disapproval of Ellie's reckless mission. "Thank God you're safe," she murmured, stepping back to examine Ellie with anxious eyes. "When the soldiers came through—" "Soldiers?" Ellie interrupted, alarm rising in her chest. "Here at the trading post?" Jackson nodded grimly as he closed the door. Behind them, Lieutenant Chambers and a small detachment arrived about 2 hours after you left. Asked a lot of questions about Comanche movements, whether we'd noticed anything unusual. His expression turned grim. "And about you." Ellie's blood ran cold. "Me? Why would they ask about me?" Martha and Jackson exchanged a significant look. Before he continued, "Someone told them about you arriving with Windrunner, about your connection to him." He hesitated before adding reluctantly, "They seem particularly interested in whether you might have knowledge of Comanche locations or plans." "Someone at the trading post informed on me," Ellie asked, the betrayal stinging unexpectedly, despite her relatively short time in the community. "Haskell, most likely," Martha said, naming one of the regular traders who had made no secret of his antipathy toward all indigenous peoples. "He's always had a poisonous tongue, especially after his brother was killed in a raid last year." The implications were clear and disturbing. If the army suspected Ellie of sympathizing with the Comanche, or worse, actively aiding them, her position at the trading post had become precarious at best, potentially dangerous at worst. "What did you tell them?" she asked Jackson, dreading, but needing to know the answer. "That you were a schoolteacher who'd survived an attack, nothing more," he replied firmly. "Said you were visiting one of the outlying families today, teaching their children as part of your duties." His expression softened slightly. Lieutenant seemed satisfied with that explanation, but I don't think he entirely believed it. Said he'd return after completing his patrol. Ellie sank into a chair, the weight of these developments settling heavily upon her shoulders. "They're heading straight for Windrunner's camp," she said quietly. "Or where it was, at least. They're evacuating to caves in the northern hills." "Will they make it in time?" Martha asked, her practical nature focusing on the immediate danger rather than broader implications. "I don't know," Ellie admitted. They were moving quickly when I left, but with children and elders to transport. She left the sentence unfinished, the possibilities too painful to articulate fully. Jackson paced the small room, his face etched with the strain of balancing competing loyalties. To his business, to his wife, to the broader community of the trading post, and to his own sense of justice. "This situation is getting more complicated by the hour," he said finally. Lieutenant made it clear the Army considers Stonewolf's raid an act of war, not just a random attack. They're determined to make a decisive response. "But Windrunner's people weren't involved in the raid," Ellie protested. "They've deliberately separated from Stonewolf's faction because they oppose violence against settlers." "Army won't care about those distinctions," Jackson replied grimly. "To them, all Comanche are potential hostiles right now, and anyone perceived as helping them." He let the implication hang in the air between them. Martha moved to put a protective arm around Ellie's shoulders. "You can't stay here," she said with quiet certainty. "Not if the lieutenant returns and starts asking more questions, especially if they don't find Windrunner's people where they expected to." The realization had been forming in Ellie's mind since hearing of the soldiers' visit, but hearing it, stated so plainly, brought its full weight crashing down upon her. The life she had begun to rebuild at the trading post, teacher, respected community member, woman with a future, was suddenly untenable. "Where would I go?" she asked, the question emerging more as a troubled thought than a real inquiry. Jackson and Martha exchanged another of those meaningful glances that suggested they had already discussed this possibility. "My brother runs a freight business in San Antonio," Jackson said carefully, "always looking for help with the accounts and correspondence. Man's brilliant with horses and cargo, but barely literate himself." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "It's not teaching, but it's honest work in a place where no one knows your history." The offer was generous, a lifeline thrown to a woman in increasingly dangerous waters. Yet Ellie found herself hesitating, her thoughts returning to Windrunner and his people fleeing toward uncertain sanctuary in the northern caves. "When would I leave?" she asked, still not fully committed to this sudden change in her circumstances. "First light would be safest," Martha replied, practical as always. "Supply wagons heading south tomorrow. Driver's trustworthy, won't ask questions if we tell him it's important." Ellie nodded slowly, understanding the necessity of this plan, even as her heart rebelled against the abandonment it represented. "What about the children, my students?" "I'll take over teaching temporarily," Martha assured her. "Did it before when needed. Not as educated as you, but I can manage the basics until a proper replacement is found." Every practical objection addressed, every logistical concern managed with frontier efficiency, and yet the deepest reason for Ellie's reluctance remained unspoken. To leave now felt like final surrender to the forces driving her and Windrunner apart, an acceptance that their paths had crossed only briefly before diverging permanently. "I need some time to think," she said finally, rising from the chair, "to decide what's best." Jackson nodded, understanding in his weathered features. "Of course, but by morning I'll have an answer," Ellie promised, "one way or another." In her small room above the trading post, Ellie stood at the familiar window, gazing out at the star-filled Texas sky as she had so many nights before. The Bone Eagle Windrunner had given her rested in her palm, its smooth contours wearing a groove in her consciousness, just as they had worn smooth from his father's handling. The logical choice was clear. Accept Jackson's offer, travel to San Antonio, build a new life far from the dangerous complexities of the frontier. She had already lost one future in the wagon train attack. Why risk losing another by remaining in a place where suspicion had begun to gather around her? Yet as she traced the carved wings of the eagle with her fingertip, another path called to her, one that logic would condemn as foolhardy, but which some deeper instinct recognized as necessary. The thought had been forming since she'd first learned of the army's approach, taking clearer shape with each new development. Windrunner's people were heading north to caves they believed would offer sanctuary. But what if the army's trackers were skilled enough to follow their trail despite precautions? What if the sanctuary proved temporary at best? They would need warning if the soldiers discovered their location, would need someone who could perhaps negotiate on their behalf rather than allowing misunderstanding to escalate into bloodshed. Someone who understood both worlds, someone who had already demonstrated willingness to risk herself for what she believed right. The decision crystallized with surprising clarity, bringing with it not peace, but a fierce determination that burned away doubt. Ellie began gathering her few possessions, packing only what was essential for the journey ahead. A change of clothing, the small medical kit Martha had provided for her previous excursion, the meager savings she had accumulated from teaching. As she worked, she composed a letter to Martha and Jackson, explaining her decision without revealing specific destinations that might compromise them if questioned. She expressed gratitude for their kindness, apologized for any difficulty her actions might cause them, and asked them to tell her students that their teacher had been called away on urgent family business. Family. The word resonated unexpectedly as she wrote it. What constituted family in this harsh frontier land where traditional bonds had been severed by distance or death? Perhaps it was simply those for whom one was willing to risk everything, in which case her path forward was clearer than ever. She slept little that night, her mind too active with planning and contingencies to surrender fully to rest. Before the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, she was dressed and ready, her small pack secured, her letter left prominently on the table where Martha would find it when she brought breakfast. The trading post slumbered as Ellie made her way silently down the back stairs and toward the stable. She had considered taking the bay mare again, but rejected the idea as unfair to Jackson, who had already risked much on her behalf. Instead, she would travel on foot until reaching the creek where Windrunner's people had planned to obscure their trail. From there, she would follow the water north, trusting in the rudimentary tracking skills she had learned during their journey. Together, the pre-dawn air carried autumn's chill as she slipped away from the trading post, staying clear of the main trail where early travelers might spot her. Her pace was steady but measured, conserving strength for what promised to be a long and difficult journey. The eastern sky gradually lightened, painting the landscape in soft pinks and golds that belied the tension gripping the territory. By mid-morning, Ellie had reached Cottonwood Creek, its waters running clear and cold between banks lined with the trees that gave it its name. She paused to refill her canteen and assess the terrain ahead. The creek's course turned gradually northwest, the direction Windrunner had indicated the caves lay. Following the waterway would provide both orientation and resources, though it might prove slower than a more direct route. As she knelt by the water's edge, a sound from the nearby trees brought her to instant alertness, a soft rustling that might have been merely wind through leaves, but which her newly honed instincts recognized as potentially human movement. She rose slowly, one hand moving to the small knife she carried at her waist, her eyes scanning the shadowed area beneath the cottonwoods. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Show yourself." For a moment, nothing moved. Then, with the silent grace she had come to associate with Comanche warriors, a familiar figure emerged from the tree line, the young guide who had escorted her back to the main trail the previous day. His expression registered surprise at finding her here, followed quickly by wary assessment. "You return," he said in halting English, the words clearly practiced but uncertain. "Why?" The direct question deserved an equally direct answer. "To help Windrunner's people," Ellie replied, gesturing toward the northern hills, "to warn if soldiers follow." The young warrior studied her face, seeming to weigh her sincerity against the suspicion that was his people's natural defense against outsiders. Finally, he made a decision, gesturing for her to follow him into the shelter of the trees. There, to Ellie's astonishment, waited 3 more warriors, their presence concealed with such skill that she would never have detected them without guidance. One she recognized as having been present when she arrived at the camp the previous day. The others were unfamiliar, but carried themselves with the confident poise of experienced fighters. The oldest of the group, a man perhaps in his 30s with a prominent scar across his left cheek, addressed her in more fluent English than the young guide had demonstrated. "I am Swift Knife," he introduced himself. "Windrunner sent us to watch the creek crossing, to ensure army not follow our people to caves." His dark eyes assessed her with uncomfortable intensity. "Why do you come back, teacher woman?" The question echoed her young guide's, but carried greater weight coming from this clearly senior warrior. Ellie met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine whether these men viewed her as ally or potential threat. "Windrunner saved my life," she said simply. "Now his people are in danger because they chose peace over war. I can help watch for soldiers, perhaps even speak with them if necessary. I understand their ways, as you cannot." Swift Knife's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes at her forthright explanation. "Windrunner said you have courage," he commented. "Did not believe white woman would return to danger once safe." Ellie wasn't certain if this represented approval or merely observation, but pressed forward regardless. "Will you take me to the caves, to Windrunner?" The 4 warriors exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that excluded her despite her physical presence. Finally, Swift Knife gave a curt nod. "You come," he decided. "But if this is trick..." He left the threat unspoken, his hand resting significantly on the knife that had clearly earned him his name. "No trick," Ellie assured him. "Only concern for those who showed me kindness when others would have killed me." This appeared to satisfy Swift Knife, for he issued rapid instructions to his companions in Comanche. 2 of the warriors melted back into the landscape, presumably to continue their watch on the creek crossing. The leader and Ellie's young guide remained, the latter offering her a water skin in a gesture that suggested at least tentative acceptance. "We travel north," Swift Knife informed her, pointing toward a barely discernible game trail that followed the creek's meandering course. "Many hours to caves. You keep pace or you stay behind." The challenge was clear, and Ellie straightened her shoulders in response. "I'll keep pace," she assured him, adjusting her small pack more securely. Their journey proved every bit as demanding as Swift Knife's warning had implied. The warriors moved with tireless efficiency through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. As they followed the creek's course into hill country, rocky outcroppings and dense thickets required careful navigation. Steep inclines tested Ellie's endurance and determination. They stopped only briefly for rest and water, the warriors clearly anxious to return to their people with news of the army's movements. Despite her resolve, Ellie found herself struggling to maintain their pace as the day wore on, her muscles protesting the unaccustomed demands placed upon them. Yet each time she felt her strength flagging, she thought of Windrunner and the children she had helped prepare for evacuation, of the elderly woman with iron-gray braids who had accepted her assistance despite obvious reservations. These people had chosen a difficult path, rejecting their kinsman's call for violence, separating from the security of the larger tribe to follow principles of peace. That choice had made them vulnerable in ways they could not have fully anticipated. When they made the decision to follow Windrunner's leadership, the least Ellie could do was endure physical discomfort to help ensure their gamble did not end in tragedy. By late afternoon, the character of the landscape had changed markedly. The gentle hills of the creek valley gave way to more dramatic terrain. Limestone cliffs rising from thick woodland, deep ravines cutting through ancient stone, the creek itself now rushing more swiftly as it navigated the increasingly vertical topography. Swift Knife called a halt as they reached a narrow canyon where the creek tumbled down a series of small waterfalls before disappearing into a crevice in the rock face. He gestured toward the cliff that loomed above them. "Caves there," he said simply. "Hidden entrance, safe place since grandfather's time." Ellie studied the imposing rock wall, seeing no obvious opening that could accommodate a group of over 100 people. "How do we reach it?" In answer, Swift Knife led them along a barely visible path that zigzagged up the canyon wall. In places, the trail was so narrow and precarious that Ellie was forced to press herself against the rock face, heart pounding as she carefully placed each foot on the crumbling limestone. The young guide followed close behind her, occasionally providing silent support when a particularly challenging section threatened her balance. Near the top of the cliff, the path disappeared entirely into what appeared to be solid rock. Swift Knife paused, issuing a distinctive bird call that echoed against the canyon walls. After a moment, a section of what Ellie had taken for stone shifted slightly, revealing a narrow fissure barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. "Entrance," Swift Knife explained with evident pride in his people's ingenuity. "From distance, looks like shadow only. Army ride past many times, never see." He gestured for Ellie to precede him into the opening. She hesitated only briefly before squeezing through the narrow gap, emerging into a passage that widened gradually as it penetrated deeper into the cliff. Natural light, filtering through hidden crevices in the rock, provided just enough illumination to navigate the uneven floor. The passage wound deeper into the hillside before suddenly opening into a vast cavern that took Ellie's breath away. The space soared overhead, natural columns of limestone rising like sentinels from floor to ceiling. Small fires dotted the expanse, their smoke-finding exit through fissures above that were invisible from outside. Around these fires gathered Windrunner's people, their lodges impossible to erect in this setting, but their essential community preserved nonetheless. Children played in small groups under watchful eyes, women prepared food or worked on intricate beadwork. Warriors maintained weapons or discussed strategy in low voices. The atmosphere was subdued but not defeated, a community adapting to challenging circumstances with the resilience that had preserved their way of life through generations of hardship. Ellie paused at the cavern's entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the scale of what Windrunner and Grey Fox had accomplished in evacuating their people to this hidden sanctuary. So absorbed was she in observing this remarkable adaptation that she didn't immediately notice the ripple of awareness spreading through the cavern as people registered her presence. Conversations faltered, activities paused, heads turned in her direction with expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion to cautious welcome. Among the children, excited whispers broke out as they recognized the white woman who had helped them pack their belongings during the hurried evacuation. "Teacher lady came back!" one small voice exclaimed in halting English, the words echoing slightly in the cavern's open space. Through the gathered people, a familiar figure approached, Windrunner, his expression shifting from disbelief to something warmer as he confirmed her identity. Behind him walked Grey Fox, the elder's face revealing nothing of his thoughts at this unexpected development. "Eleanor," Windrunner said as he reached her, her name carrying a wealth of unspoken questions. "Why have you returned?" Before she could answer, Swift Knife stepped forward to address both Windrunner and Grey Fox, speaking rapidly in Comanche. Ellie understood nothing of his words, but their effect was visible in the leaders' reactions, concern deepening in their expressions, and increased tension in their postures. "What is it?" she asked when Swift-Knife had finished his report. "What's happened?" Windrunner turned to her, his dark eyes grave with fresh knowledge. "The army has divided its forces," he explained. "Half continue to search for Stonewolf's band to the east, but the others—" He hesitated before continuing. "They have found signs of our passage at the creek. They follow our trail north." The implications were immediate and alarming. The caves might be well hidden, but determined trackers with sufficient time and resources could eventually discover even the most carefully concealed entrance. What had seemed a secure sanctuary suddenly appeared far more vulnerable. "How long do we have?" Ellie asked, her mind already racing through possibilities and contingencies. "Not long enough," Grey Fox answered grimly, surprising her by entering the conversation directly. "By morning, perhaps sooner, they will reach the canyon." Windrunner gestured toward where several warriors had gathered in urgent consultation. "We discuss options. None are good. To fight means bloodshed on both sides. To flee means exposure in open country where cavalry moves faster than our people." Ellie absorbed this assessment, understanding the impossible position in which Windrunner's people now found themselves. Then a thought occurred to her, a possibility both dangerous and potentially transformative. "What if I went to meet them?" she suggested. "As a representative of your group, I could explain that you had nothing to do with the raid, that you've separated from Stonewolf precisely because you oppose violence against settlers." Windrunner's expression immediately hardened. "Too dangerous," he declared flatly. "Army officers do not listen to women, especially women they suspect of sympathizing with enemies." "They might listen to a white schoolteacher," Ellie countered. "Especially one who can speak English fluently and understands their cultural expectations." She turned to include Grey Fox in her appeal. "It's worth trying before resigning ourselves to conflict or flight, isn't it?" The elder studied her with penetrating intensity, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Why would you risk this for us?" he asked finally, the direct question cutting through peripheral concerns to the heart of the matter. Ellie met his gaze steadily. "Because unnecessary death benefits no one. Because children shouldn't suffer for adults' inability to understand one another. Because—" She hesitated, then finished simply, "because it's the right thing to do." Grey Fox and Windrunner exchanged a long look, some unspoken communication passing between them that excluded Ellie, despite her central role in the discussion. Finally, the elder gave a slight nod, deferring to Windrunner's judgment in this matter that so directly concerned an outsider. "We will consider this option," Windrunner said carefully, "but not alone. If you go, warriors will watch from hiding. For protection." Ellie understood the multiple layers of this arrangement. Protection for her, yes, but also insurance against possible betrayal, however unintentional. "I understand," she agreed. "When would I go?" With a final nod, Windrunner stepped aside, allowing her to precede him down the treacherous path that zigzagged toward the canyon floor. Swift-Knife waited below, his lean form almost invisible against the rocky terrain until he moved to join them. Without unnecessary discussion, he led them away from the cave entrance, following a route that would leave minimal sign of their passage. The journey to the army encampment demanded all of Ellie's concentration. The terrain was challenging even in growing daylight, loose scree that threatened to slide beneath unwary feet, sharp limestone outcroppings that could tear flesh. With a moment's inattention, thick underbrush that concealed sudden drops or animal burrows. Swift-Knife moved with the fluid grace of one born to this landscape, occasionally pausing to ensure she navigated particularly difficult sections safely. Windrunner had remained behind at the cave entrance, his responsibilities to the larger group preventing him from accompanying her on this dangerous mission. Yet Ellie felt his presence nonetheless, his concern and confidence traveling with her like twin companions as she followed Swift Knife's lead through the awakening wilderness. They traveled in silence, conversation unnecessary and potentially dangerous as they drew closer to the army's position. Occasionally, Swift Knife would freeze, raising a hand to signal that Ellie should do likewise, his head cocked slightly as he listened for sounds beyond her perception. Each time, after a long moment, he would resume their journey, apparently satisfied that no immediate threat lurked nearby. The sun had fully cleared the horizon, painting the canyon in gold and amber light, when Swift Knife finally brought them to a halt behind a natural formation of boulders. He gestured for Ellie to join him at a narrow gap between the stones, pointing toward a clearing perhaps half a mile distant where canvas tents stood in ordered rows beside a bend in the creek. The army encampment was smaller than Ellie had anticipated. Perhaps 20 tents arranged in military precision, with horses picketed in a makeshift corral nearby. Men moved about the camp with purpose, some tending cooking fires, others cleaning weapons, or consulting over what appeared to be maps spread on a portable table. At the perimeter, sentries stood at regular intervals, rifles at the ready as they scanned the surrounding terrain. "Lieutenant's tent," Swift Knife murmured, indicating a slightly larger structure near the center of the encampment from which a young officer had just emerged. Chambers, hard man, not friend to Comanche. Ellie studied the officer, a tall, lean figure with the rigid posture of career military. Even at this distance, his bearing suggested confidence bordering on arrogance, the stance of a man accustomed to immediate obedience and unquestioned authority. "You go from there," Swift Knife continued, pointing to a spot where the creek curved closest to their current position. "Walk open, hands where they see. Soldiers nervous, shoot quick sometimes." The warning was unnecessary but appreciated. Ellie had no illusions about the danger she faced in approaching an army camp unannounced in territory they considered hostile. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, could end her mission before it properly began. "Warriors watch," Swift Knife assured her, somehow reading her apprehension despite her efforts to conceal it. "See everything, hear everything." Ellie nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady her nerves. "Tell Windrunner I'll do my best," she said quietly. Swift Knife regarded her with an unreadable expression. "He knows," he replied simply. Then, with a slight inclination of his head that might have been respect, he melted back into the landscape, leaving Ellie alone to complete her self-appointed task. For a moment, she remained motionless, gathering her courage and reviewing her approach one final time. Then, squaring her shoulders, she stepped out from behind the boulders and began walking openly toward the creek crossing, her pace deliberate and unhurried, her hands held slightly away from her body to signal she carried no weapons. She had covered perhaps half the distance to the creek when a shout from the nearest sentry alerted the camp to her presence. The reaction was immediate and alarming, soldiers reaching for rifles, the lieutenant emerging from a group of men to stare in her direction, orders being barked that carried clearly across the intervening space. "Halt where you are!" The command rang out, emphasized by the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. Ellie stopped immediately, maintaining her open-handed posture as two soldiers approached cautiously, rifles leveled at her chest. Behind them, the lieutenant watched with narrow-eyed assessment, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. "Identify yourself," one of the soldiers demanded as they drew within speaking distance. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell," she replied, keeping her voice steady and clear. "I'm the schoolteacher from Jackson's trading post." The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly not having anticipated this response. "What are you doing out here, ma'am?" The second soldier asked, his tone marginally less hostile than his companions. "I need to speak with Lieutenant Chambers," Ellie said, directing her gaze toward the officer who continued to observe from a distance. "It's a matter of urgency concerning your current mission." This statement produced another round of uncertain glances between the soldiers. Finally, the first man gestured with his rifle. "Hands on your head, ma'am. We'll escort you to the lieutenant." Ellie complied without protest, understanding that cooperation was her only viable path forward. With a soldier on either side, she was marched across the creek, the water cold through her boots, and into the encampment where curious eyes tracked her progress toward the command tent. Lieutenant Chambers waited outside, his posture rigid with military formality, his expression revealing nothing as she approached. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, though the harsh conditions of frontier service had carved premature lines around his eyes and mouth. His uniform, despite the rigors of field operations, maintained a crispness that spoke of disciplined attention to detail. "Miss Mitchell," he said as the soldiers brought her to a halt before him, "Jackson mentioned you were teaching at the trading post." His tone suggested this information was being verified rather than merely acknowledged. "He didn't mention you were in the habit of wandering alone through hostile territory." "These are unusual circumstances, Lieutenant," Ellie replied, matching his formal tone. "May I lower my hands? I assure you I'm not armed." Chambers studied her for a moment longer before giving a curt nod. As Ellie gratefully lowered her arms, he dismissed the escorting soldiers with a gesture, though they retreated only a short distance, close enough to intervene if necessary. "You say you have information regarding our mission," the officer continued, his voice pitched to reveal nothing of his thoughts. "I'm interested to hear how a schoolteacher comes by such knowledge." The implied suspicion was clear, and Ellie recognized the precariousness of her position. Too much honesty could undermine her credibility. Too little might be interpreted as deliberate deception. "Word travels quickly on the frontier, Lieutenant," she said carefully. "When your men visited the trading post asking about Comanche movements, it wasn't difficult to connect recent events with your presence here." "And what recent events would those be, Miss Mitchell?" Chambers asked, his tone deceptively conversational. "The raid on the Henderson homestead," Ellie replied promptly, "and your assignment to locate and punish those responsible." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps or grudging respect, crossed the lieutenant's face before his professional mask reasserted itself. "That still doesn't explain why you're here," he observed, "or how you located our camp with such precision." Ellie had anticipated this question and prepared her response accordingly. "I followed the creek north from the trading post," she explained. "It's the most logical route through this terrain, and your campfire smoke was visible from some distance this morning." Chambers' eyes narrowed slightly, suggesting he found this explanation plausible, but perhaps not entirely satisfying. Before he could press further, Ellie seized the initiative. "Lieutenant, I've come because there's a critical distinction you need to understand regarding the Comanche in this region," she said urgently. "The band responsible for the Henderson raid is led by a warrior named Stone Wolf. But there's another group, led by a man called Windrunner, who broke away from Stone Wolf's leadership precisely because they oppose violence against settlers." The lieutenant's expression hardened at this information. "You seem remarkably well-informed about Comanche politics, Miss Mitchell," he observed, a new edge entering his voice. "Most frontier schoolteachers couldn't distinguish between one hostile and another." "Most frontier schoolteachers haven't survived a wagon train massacre," Ellie countered, allowing a hint of her own hardship to color her words. "When you've faced death at the hands of raiders, you develop a keen interest in understanding who might wish you harm and who might not." This reference to her personal tragedy seemed to give Chambers pause. His gaze sharpened with renewed assessment, as though seeing her properly for the first time, rather than merely as an unexpected complication in his mission. "Jackson mentioned you were the sole survivor of the Dry Creek attack," he acknowledged, his tone marginally less suspicious, though he was rather vague about how you made your way to the trading post afterward. Ellie recognized both the opening this provided and the danger it represented. "It's not a journey I care to recall in detail, Lieutenant," she said, allowing genuine emotion to surface, "but it taught me that survival sometimes depends on recognizing allies where conventional wisdom sees only enemies." A muscle twitched in Chambers' jaw as he absorbed this statement. "You're suggesting that this Windrunner and his people should be considered allies?" The skepticism in his voice was palpable. "I'm suggesting they shouldn't be considered enemies," Ellie clarified. "They've separated from Stonewolf's band at considerable risk to themselves because they believe peaceful coexistence with settlers is possible. Treating them as hostiles serves neither justice nor the Army's broader mission in this territory." For a long moment, Chambers said nothing, his gaze fixed on Ellie with uncomfortable intensity as he weighed her words against his orders and experience. Around them, the camp had grown unusually quiet, soldiers finding reasons to linger within earshot of this unexpected confrontation between their commanding officer and a frontier schoolteacher. "Where is this peaceful band now?" Chambers asked. Finally, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp with calculation. Ellie had prepared for this critical question, knowing her answer would determine whether her mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. "I don't know their exact location," she said, a technical truth that concealed a deeper knowledge. "But I do know they're hiding in fear of being caught in the middle of a conflict not of their making." "Convenient," Chambers remarked dryly. "You vouch for their peaceful intentions, but can't produce them for questioning." "I'm not asking you to take my word alone, Lieutenant," Ellie countered, sensing his dismissal gathering momentum. "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that military intelligence might be incomplete, that the situation might be more complex than originally presented." The lieutenant's expression suggested this approach had struck a chord, perhaps appealing to his professional pride or touching on frustrations he himself had experienced with the limitations of frontier reconnaissance. "Even if what you say is true, Miss Mitchell," he said after a moment's consideration, "I have my orders. The raid on the Henderson place can't go unanswered. The territorial governor has demanded decisive action against Comanche insurgents. Stone Wolf and his raiders should face consequences," Ellie agreed readily. "But punishing those who actively oppose such violence only strengthens extremists within the tribe, while undermining those who seek peace." Chambers paced a few steps, his brow furrowed in thought. When he turned back to Ellie, his expression had shifted subtly. Still guarded, still skeptical, but with a new consideration that hadn't been present before. "You've taken an extraordinary risk coming here," he observed. "Why?" The question, simple and direct, cut through peripheral arguments to the heart of the matter. Ellie met his gaze steadily, recognizing that honesty, carefully measured, offered her best chance of reaching this man. "Because unnecessary death serves no one, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "Not the army, not the settlers, not the Comanche, who want peace. And because someone needed to speak for those caught between forces they can't control." Something in her words or manner seemed to resonate with Chambers. He studied her for a long moment before turning to address a sergeant, who had been hovering nearby throughout their conversation. "Sergeant Miller, have the scouts reported any sign of Comanche movement in the northern canyons?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was information he already possessed, but wished to confirm. "No, sir," the sergeant replied promptly. "Trail went cold about 2 miles upstream. Wilson thinks they doubled back through the creek to hide their direction." Chambers nodded thoughtfully, returning his attention to Ellie. "You understand my position, Miss Mitchell. I have explicit orders to locate and neutralize the Comanche responsible for the Henderson raid. Evidence indicates they fled in this direction. Stonewolf's band went east, Ellie said before she could stop herself, the critical information slipping out in her eagerness to redirect the military's attention. The lieutenant's eyebrows rose slightly. And how would you know that? Ellie silently cursed her impetuosity before crafting a plausible explanation. Traders who passed through 2 days ago reported seeing a large group moving east across the plains. Jackson assumed they were Stonewolf's people, based on the direction and timing. Whether Chambers believed this improvisation was impossible to determine from his expression. He merely nodded slowly, as though adding this information to some internal calculation whose parameters remained hidden from her. I appreciate your concern for preventing unnecessary bloodshed, he said finally, his tone suggesting he had reached some decision. And I'm not unsympathetic to the possibility that not all Comanche share Stonewolf's violent intentions. He straightened, his posture reclaiming full military rigidity. However, my orders remain unchanged. We will continue our search of this area as planned. Disappointment flooded through Ellie, but before she could formulate a response, the lieutenant continued, "That said, I'm willing to modify our approach somewhat." He turned to address the sergeant again. "Miller, inform the men we're looking specifically for Stonewolf's band. Any Comanche encountered are to be questioned but not fired upon unless they initiate hostilities. Understood?" "Yes, sir," the sergeant responded, though his expression suggested he found these instructions somewhat unusual. Chambers returned his attention to Ellie. "That's the most accommodation I can make within the parameters of my orders, Miss Mitchell. We will continue searching this area, but with, let's call it, increased discernment regarding which Comanche we consider hostile." It wasn't everything Ellie had hoped to achieve, but it represented a significant concession nonetheless, one that might be sufficient to prevent immediate bloodshed if Windrunner's people were discovered. She inclined her head in acknowledgement of this partial victory. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said sincerely. "That's all I can reasonably ask." Chambers studied her with renewed intensity, as though trying to reconcile her passionate advocacy with his understanding of frontier schoolteachers. "You're either remarkably naive or remarkably brave, Miss Mitchell," he observed finally. "I'm not entirely sure which." "Perhaps a bit of both," Ellie admitted with a small smile. "The frontier doesn't encourage conventional thinking, as I'm sure you've discovered yourself." This observation drew an unexpected quirk of the lieutenant's lips, not quite a smile, but a momentary easing of his rigid demeanor. "Indeed," he agreed dryly. "Now I'll have 2 of my men escort you back to the trading post. It's not safe for you to travel alone, regardless of your unconventional capabilities." Ellie had anticipated this complication. The lieutenant would naturally wish to ensure her safe return, but such an escort would prevent her from warning Windrunner about the Army's continued search. She needed to decline without arousing further suspicion. "That's very considerate, Lieutenant," she said carefully, "but unnecessary. I made it here safely enough, and daylight travel poses minimal risk in territory your men have already secured." Chambers frowned, clearly disinclined to accept this reasoning. "It's not a request, Miss Mitchell. The escort is as much for my peace of mind as your safety." His tone softened marginally as he added, "Consider it my way of ensuring your courageous initiative doesn't end in personal tragedy." Recognizing further argument would only strengthen his resolve and potentially reignite his suspicions, Ellie nodded reluctantly. "As you wish, Lieutenant. When would we depart?" "Immediately," Chambers replied, gesturing to the sergeant who still lingered nearby. "Miller, assign Davidson and Mercer to escort duty. They're to see Miss Mitchell safely to Jackson's trading post, then rejoin the company by nightfall." "Yes, sir," the sergeant acknowledged, moving away to locate the designated soldiers. Chambers turned back to Ellie, his expression once again unreadable. "I hope your faith in these peaceful Comanche isn't misplaced, Miss Mitchell, for your sake as well as theirs." "So do I, Lieutenant," Ellie responded truthfully. "So do." Within minutes, 2 soldiers appeared, horses saddled and ready for the journey. Sergeant Miller introduced them curtly as Privates Davidson and Mercer. The former, a weathered veteran with a salt and pepper beard, the latter barely out of boyhood with a face still spotted with acne. Both regarded Ellie with undisguised curiosity, clearly having heard something of her unexpected appearance and unusual advocacy. A horse was provided for her as well, a steady-looking bay gelding with army markings. As she prepared to mount, Ellie cast a final glance toward the surrounding hills, wondering if Windrunner's warriors still watched, if they had heard enough of her conversation with the lieutenant to understand the partial victory, and continued danger it represented. Lieutenant Chambers himself approached as she settled into the saddle, his hand resting briefly on the gelding's neck as he looked up at her. "Safe journey, Miss Mitchell," he said formally. "And a word of advice, if I may. Teaching is an honorable profession with relatively clear boundaries. I suggest you remain within them in the future." The warning, for all its civil delivery, carried unmistakable weight. Ellie inclined her head in acknowledgement, without committing herself to the implied restriction. "Thank you for hearing me out, Lieutenant. Not every military man would have shown such consideration." A flicker of something, perhaps grudging, respect crossed Chambers' face before he stepped back, offering a perfunctory salute that seemed half genuine, half ironic. At his nod, Davidson took the lead, guiding them out of the encampment toward the creek crossing Ellie had navigated earlier that morning. As they rode away from the army camp, Ellie found her thoughts divided between immediate concerns and longer-term implications. The escort presented an immediate tactical problem: how to warn Windrunner that the army's search would continue, albeit with modified rules of engagement. Beyond that loomed the larger question of what would happen when Lieutenant Chambers completed his mission, one way or another, and returned to the settlements. Her advocacy for the Comanche would certainly be reported, adding to the growing suspicion that had already begun to gather around her at the trading post. They followed the creek southward, the 2 soldiers positioning themselves on either side of Ellie in a formation that was ostensibly protective, but effectively restrictive as well. Davidson, the older soldier, maintained a businesslike silence, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts about this unusual assignment. Mercer, by contrast, seemed bursting with curiosity, repeatedly glancing at Ellie as though working up the courage to speak. "Something on your mind, Private?" Ellie finally asked, breaking the increasingly uncomfortable silence. Mercer flushed visibly, caught in his transparent interest. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but is it true you survived the Dry Creek massacre all on your own?" Davidson shot his younger companion a quelling look, but Ellie merely smiled slightly. "Not entirely on my own," she acknowledged, seeing no reason to conceal what the army likely already knew through Jackson's account. "I had help reaching the trading post." "Comanche help?" Mercer pressed, his youthful face alight with the fascination of frontier mythology. "Is that why you came to speak for them today?" Before Ellie could respond, Davidson interrupted, gruffly. "That's enough questions, Mercer. Miss Mitchell isn't here for your entertainment." The reproof silenced the young private immediately, his face reddening further as he mumbled an apology. Ellie, however, recognized an opportunity in the older soldier's intervention. "It's quite all right," she assured Davidson. "His curiosity is natural given the circumstances." She turned her attention back to Mercer. "Yes, I received help from a Comanche warrior after the attack. That experience taught me that judging an entire people based on the actions of some is both unfair and unwise." Davidson snorted softly, though whether in disagreement or reluctant concurrence was difficult to determine. "Frontier's not a place for abstract principles, ma'am. he said after a moment. "Out here, mistakes in judgment tend to be permanent." "I'm well aware of that, Private," Ellie replied, a hint of steel entering her voice as she recalled her days alone after the Wagon train attack. "But so are mistakes of prejudice." This observation earned her a sharp, assessing look from Davidson, who seemed to be recalibrating his impression of the schoolteacher in their charge. "You've got opinions, I'll give you that," he acknowledged. Grudgingly, "Just hope they don't get you killed before you learn better." "Or perhaps before others learn better," Ellie countered mildly. The exchange lapsed into silence after that, each rider apparently absorbed in private thoughts as they continued southward. The creek valley gradually widened, the terrain becoming less dramatic as they left the canyon country behind. By midday, they had reached more familiar landscape, the rolling prairie that surrounded the trading post, dotted with occasional stands of cottonwood and mesquite. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and consume a sparse meal of hardtack and jerky that Davidson produced from his saddlebags. As they ate, Ellie considered and discarded various strategies for separating from her escorts before reaching the trading post. Each possibility seemed likely to fail, or worse, to confirm whatever suspicions Lieutenant Chambers might still harbor about her motives and connections. Her opportunity came unexpectedly as they remounted to continue their journey. Davidson's horse, seemingly spooked by something in the underbrush, reared suddenly, throwing the experienced soldier to the ground with bone-jarring force. His head struck a rock as he fell, rendering him instantly unconscious, blood seeping from a gash at his temple. Mercer reacted with panicked inexperience, leaping from his own mount to kneel beside his fallen comrade. "Davidson, can you hear me?" When no response came, he looked up at Ellie with naked fear in his young face. "He's hurt bad, ma'am. What should we do?" The situation presented both crisis and opportunity. Ellie dismounted quickly, moving to examine Davidson's injury with the practical competence she had developed through frontier necessity. The wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening. The greater concern was the concussion, almost certainly resulting from the impact. "He needs proper medical attention," she said decisively. "The trading post is still several hours away at normal pace, and moving him carelessly could worsen his condition." Mercer's expression betrayed his conflicted priorities, duty to his wounded comrade versus his assignment to escort Ellie safely to the trading post. "Lieutenant Chambers ordered us to stay together," he said uncertainly. "Under normal circumstances, yes," Ellie agreed, seizing the opening his hesitation provided. "But these aren't normal circumstances. Davidson needs help as quickly as possible, and dividing our resources is the logical solution." She outlined her proposal with calm authority that belied her racing thoughts. Mercer would remain with Davidson, making him as comfortable as possible while keeping pressure on the wound. Ellie would ride ahead to the trading post at greater speed than they could manage as a group, alerting Jackson to send his wagon with proper medical supplies to transport the injured soldier. "It's the only sensible approach," she concluded, watching indecision war with duty on Mercer's youthful features. "I don't know, ma'am," he hedged, glancing back toward the northern hills as though seeking guidance from the distant lieutenant. "If anything happened to you along the way—" "Nothing will happen," Ellie assured him with more confidence than she felt. "We've seen no sign of danger all morning, and I know this territory well enough to avoid trouble." She gestured toward Davidson's still form. "Every minute we delay puts him at greater risk." This appeal to his companion's welfare finally tipped the balance in Mercer's internal debate. "All right," he agreed reluctantly, "but you head straight for the trading post. No detours, no stopping for any reason. Mr. Jackson needs to send help as quick as possible." "Absolutely," Ellie promised, remounting with an alacrity that might have seemed suspicious under closer scrutiny. "Keep him still and maintain pressure on that wound. Help will come as soon as humanly possible." Without giving the young private time to reconsider, she wheeled the bay gelding around and set off at a brisk trot toward the trading post, or at least in that general direction until she passed beyond Mercer's line of sight. Guilt nagged at her for the deception, but she consoled herself with the knowledge that she would indeed send help for Davidson once her more urgent mission was completed. As soon as she was certain she could no longer be observed from the creek bed where she had left the soldiers, Ellie altered course, turning the gelding northwest toward the canyon where Windrunner's people had sought refuge. The army horse responded well to her commands, seemingly grateful for the opportunity to move at a pace more vigorous than the escort duty had permitted. Ellie rode with purpose, but not reckless haste, understanding that reaching the caves quickly would serve no one if she injured herself or the horse in the process. Her mind raced ahead to what she would tell Windrunner: the partial success of her negotiation with Lieutenant Chambers, the modified orders that might prevent immediate violence if contact occurred, but also the continued threat represented by the Army's determination to complete its search of the northern canyons. She had covered perhaps half the distance back to the cave system when movement in her peripheral vision caused her to rein in sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she no longer carried. A moment later, she relaxed as a familiar figure emerged from a stand of juniper, swift knife, his expression registering both surprise and approval at her unexpected reappearance. "You escape soldiers," he observed, moving alongside her horse, with the silent grace she had come to associate with Comanche warriors. "They were escorting me back to the trading post," Ellie explained quickly. "There was an accident. One was injured. I convinced the other to let me ride ahead for help." She glanced northward with renewed urgency. "I need to speak with Windrunner immediately. The army will continue searching the canyons, though Lieutenant Chambers has ordered his men not to fire unless fired upon first." Swift Knife absorbed this information with characteristic economy of expression. "Come," he said simply, altering their direction slightly to follow what appeared to be a game trail invisible to Ellie's less experienced eyes. Faster way to caves. As they traveled, Ellie provided a more detailed account of her conversation with Lieutenant Chambers, including both the encouraging aspects of his response and the concerning limitations of his concessions. Swift Knife listened without comment, though occasional nods suggested he recognized the significance of particular points in her narrative. The trail he followed indeed proved more direct than the route Ellie had taken that morning, bringing them to the base of the canyon in considerably less time than she had anticipated. As they approached the hidden path leading up to the cave entrance, Swift Knife issued a distinctive bird call, the same signal she had heard him use earlier to announce their presence to guards concealed among the rocks. Almost immediately, Windrunner appeared on a narrow ledge above them, his expression shifting from vigilant readiness to visible relief as he recognized Ellie. He descended rapidly, reaching the canyon floor just as she dismounted from the army gelding. "You returned," he said simply, the words carrying weight beyond their literal meaning. "We feared." The lieutenant agreed to modify his orders, Ellie explained without preamble, knowing time was precious. "His men won't fire unless fired upon first. But they're still searching the canyons. They haven't abandoned the mission entirely." The elder's eyes crinkled slightly at this understated response. "Indeed." He turned to address the other leaders in Comanche, a discussion that Ellie could follow only through tone and gesture rather than words. The debate appeared intense but disciplined, each speaker given respectful attention before another voice joined the deliberation. Windrunner participated actively, his arguments carrying the passionate conviction she had come to associate with him. Occasionally, his gaze would shift to her, including her in the conversation, even though language excluded her direct participation. It was a small courtesy, but one that touched her deeply. Finally, Grey Fox raised his hand, apparently signaling that a decision had been reached. He turned back to Ellie, switching once more to his accented but clear English. "We go deeper," he announced, "to the sacred chambers, where even most Comanche have never walked. It is dangerous path, narrow passages, deep drops, but soldiers will not find us there." Windrunner stepped forward to elaborate. "The inner caves extend for miles beneath the hills. Our ancestors used them in times of greatest danger, passing knowledge of their existence only to tribal leaders and selected warriors." "How long can you survive there?" Ellie asked, concerned about practical considerations of food, water, and air in such confined spaces. "Underground streams provide water," Windrunner explained, "and we have provisions for perhaps 2 weeks. By then, the army must either find us or abandon their search." The prospect of 2 weeks in subterranean darkness seemed daunting, particularly for the children and elders, but Ellie understood the calculus behind the decision. Above ground, discovery was increasingly likely as the army methodically searched the canyon system. Underground, they sacrificed comfort for security. "When will you move?" she asked. "Immediately," Grey Fox replied. "No time to waste. Army comes closer with each passing hour." Already, the cavern hummed with renewed activity as the decision spread through the community. Families gathered essential belongings, discarding anything bulky or unnecessary. Warriors organized supplies into manageable bundles that could be transported through narrow passages. Women prepared travois for elders too frail to manage difficult terrain, while children were assigned simple tasks to keep them occupied and give them a sense of purpose amid the tension. Watching this efficient response to crisis, Ellie was struck again by the resilience of Windrunner's people, their ability to adapt to changing circumstances without surrendering to panic or despair. It was a quality she had come to deeply admire during her brief but intense association with them. Windrunner approached, momentarily free from leadership responsibilities. "You should return to the trading post," he said, though his tone suggested reluctance rather than dismissal. "Swift Knife will have delivered your message by now. Your continued absence will raise questions." Ellie knew he was right, logically, practically right. Her place in this unfolding drama had already extended far beyond what anyone might have anticipated. She had delivered her warning, influenced military tactics as much as possible, and helped Windrunner's people prepare for what lay ahead. From a rational perspective, her role was complete. Yet the thought of simply walking away, of returning to the trading post to resume teaching, while these people faced darkness and danger, felt impossible to contemplate. "I want to stay," she said before fully considering the implications of such a decision. Windrunner's expression shifted subtly, a complexity of emotions crossing his features before settling into somber assessment. "The journey underground will be difficult," he warned. "Dangerous for those not born to our ways, and if you do not return..." He left the sentence unfinished, but Ellie understood its conclusion. If she disappeared along with Windrunner's band, any hope of maintaining her position at the trading post would vanish. Lieutenant Chambers would almost certainly interpret her absence as confirmation of his suspicions. At best, she would be labeled a Comanche sympathizer. At worst, a traitor to her own people. "I understand the consequences," she assured him, surprised by her own certainty, "but I've made my choice." Windrunner studied her face, as though searching for hesitation or doubt. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Then we prepare you as best we can for what lies ahead." Preparations proved both practical and ceremonial. A Comanche woman named Singing Bird, one of the few who spoke functional English, provided Ellie with more suitable clothing for the journey ahead. Soft-soled moccasins that would grip stone better than her boots, leggings that allowed greater freedom of movement, and a fringed tunic belted at the waist to keep fabric from catching on narrow passages. As Ellie changed behind a screen of hides, she heard Singing Bird explaining in her halting English that the clothing had belonged to her daughter before marriage took her to another band. "Good medicine," the woman insisted, making gestures. Ellie interpreted as warding off danger, protection for difficult journey. Meanwhile, Windrunner conferred with Grey Fox and several other leaders, occasionally glancing in Ellie's direction with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Whatever they discussed appeared significant, generating solemn nods from the elder and thoughtful consideration from the warriors. By mid-afternoon, preparations were complete. Families had been organized into groups for the journey inward, each assigned a warrior guide familiar with the cave system. Torches and small oil lamps had been prepared, though Windrunner warned they must be used sparingly to preserve air in the deeper chambers. Essential provisions had been distributed among able-bodied members to ensure no individual carried excessive weight through narrow passages. Grey Fox approached where Ellie stood with Singing Bird, his weathered face solemn but not unwelcoming. "Teacher woman joins our journey to darkness," he stated. Not quite a question, but not quite an assertion either. "Yes," Ellie confirmed, "if you'll have me." The elder studied her with eyes that seemed to see beyond surface appearances to something deeper. "Windrunner says you have heart of Comanche, though skin is pale," he observed. "Brave heart. True heart." He reached into a small pouch at his waist, withdrawing what appeared to be a smooth stone, threaded on a leather cord. "Protection," he said, placing it in her palm. "From ancestors." The gift, clearly of deep significance coming from the tribal elder, left Ellie momentarily speechless. "Thank you," she managed finally, slipping the cord over her head so the stone rested against her heart. "I'm honored." Grey Fox nodded once, satisfied with her response, before moving away to oversee final preparations. Singing Bird helped Ellie secure her hair in a practical style that wouldn't catch on stone outcroppings, murmuring what sounded like protective prayers or chants as she worked. Windrunner found her as the first groups prepared to enter the narrow passage leading to the inner caves. "You will travel in my group," he informed her. "Stay close. The path is treacherous for those who do not know it." Ellie nodded, determined to follow instructions precisely rather than become a liability to those around her. "I'm ready." The journey into darkness began with Grey Fox leading the procession, his elderly frame belying surprising strength and agility as he negotiated the initial passage. Families followed in designated order, moving with the quiet efficiency Ellie had come to associate with Windrunner's people. Warriors took strategic positions throughout the line, maintaining discipline and providing assistance where needed. Windrunner's group, which included several women, 2 small children, and an elderly man supported by his grandsons, waited until nearly half the community had entered the passage. When their turn came, he positioned Ellie directly behind him, instructing her to maintain contact with the back of his tunic whenever visibility diminished. The first section proved relatively manageable, a sloping tunnel wide enough for single file travel, its walls rough-hewn by water and time rather than human tools. Sporadic torches illuminated the way, casting long shadows that danced across stone surfaces worn smooth by generations of passage. But as they descended deeper, the nature of the journey changed dramatically. The relatively uniform tunnel gave way to a complex network of smaller passages, some requiring crawling rather than walking, others narrowing to gaps that challenged even the smallest adults. Torches became fewer, darkness more absolute between islands of flickering light. Ellie focused entirely on Windrunner's back, trusting his guidance as they navigated increasingly challenging terrain. Her knees soon ached from crawling across stone, Her shoulders protested passages that required sideways shuffling through narrow gaps. Yet she maintained pace with the group, refusing to become the weak link in their collective chain of survival. How long they traveled through this underground labyrinth, Ellie couldn't accurately judge. Time seemed distorted in the absence of sunlight, minutes stretching to feel like hours as they negotiated particularly difficult sections. The sound of water grew gradually louder, sometimes a gentle trickle nearby, other times a distant roar suggesting larger underground streams, or perhaps even waterfalls concealed in the darkness. Finally, after what might have been 3 hours or might have been 6, the narrow passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber that drew gasps of amazement even from those Comanche who had anticipated its existence. Torches carried by advance. Groups revealed a cavern of breathtaking proportions, its ceiling soaring beyond the reach of their modest illumination, its walls adorned with mineral formations that glittered like countless stars against the darkness. An underground stream bisected the chamber, its waters crystal clear and cold when Ellie knelt to touch them at Windrunner's invitation. Along the cavern's perimeter, smaller alcoves offered natural divisions that families quickly claimed as temporary living spaces. The atmosphere, despite their dire circumstances, carried an almost reverent quality, as though they had entered a natural cathedral whose grandeur transcended their immediate concerns. Grey Fox stood near the chamber's center, addressing the gathered community in Comanche. Though Ellie couldn't understand his words, the tone conveyed both acknowledgement of their difficult circumstances and affirmation of their collective strength. When he finished, people moved with renewed purpose to establish this underground refuge as habitable space. Windrunner joined Ellie where she stood observing these activities. "My ancestors sheltered here during great wars before white settlers came," he explained quietly. "They left markings, stories, on walls deeper within." He gestured toward darker recesses beyond their current position. "Perhaps someday I will show you." The simple statement carried profound implications, a suggestion of future beyond their immediate crisis, of continued connection rather than inevitable separation. Ellie felt its significance resonate through her with surprising force. "I would like that," she replied simply. For 2 days, they existed in this subterranean world, adapting to its rhythms and requirements with remarkable resilience. Children who had initially found the darkness frightening soon discovered games suited to their new environment. Shadow plays against cavern walls, echo games that sent their voices bouncing through connected chambers, exploration of safe areas. Under careful supervision, Ellie found herself naturally assuming teaching responsibilities, gathering children during designated day periods to continue their education despite their unusual circumstances. Without books or conventional materials, she drew upon memory and creativity, using stories to teach language, smooth stones for counting and basic mathematics, natural formations to illustrate principles of earth science. Windrunner often observed these impromptu lessons, sometimes contributing knowledge of plants or animals that complemented Ellie's more formal education. Together, they created a hybrid curriculum that bridged their different worlds, Boston scholarship blending, with generations of practical wisdom passed through Comanche oral tradition. On the third morning, time now marked by scheduled lighting and extinguishing of central torches rather than solar movement, Swift Knife returned from a scouting mission to the cave entrance, bringing news that electrified the community. The army had departed, breaking camp and moving eastward after apparently receiving new intelligence about Stone Wolf's location. Grey Fox called council immediately, gathering warriors and elders to evaluate this development. Windrunner insisted that Ellie join them, positioning her beside him in the circle of firelight as Swift Knife delivered his detailed report. "Soldiers gone since yesterday," the scout confirmed in his limited English, ensuring Ellie understood. This crucial information, Tracks show all men, all horses heading east. None remain to watch caves. Cautious optimism spread through the council, though veteran warriors counseled against immediate return to the surface. Could be trick, one suggested through Windrunner's translation. Army sometimes leaves, watches from distance, returns when people emerge. After lengthy discussion, Grey Fox reached a measured decision. A small party of warriors would maintain watch from concealed positions near the cave entrance for 2 full days. If no army presence was detected during that time, they would begin gradual relocation back to the main cavern and eventually to the surface. Wisdom of patience, Grey Fox pronounced, nodding toward Ellie to ensure she understood the conclusion. We have survived this long. 2 more days changes nothing. And the waiting period passed with strange duality. Tension and boredom intertwined as the community balanced vigilance with the mundane requirements of daily existence. Ellie continued her teaching, expanded now to include adults interested in improving their English skills. Several women reciprocated by teaching her basic Comanche phrases and songs, the linguistic exchange creating bonds that transcended their temporary refuge. Windrunner divided his time between leadership responsibilities and increasingly frequent conversations with Ellie. Sitting beside one of the small fires permitted for cooking and minimal light, they shared stories of their vastly different upbringings, her childhood in Boston's structured propriety, his education in Comanche traditions and survival skills. Despite their disparate backgrounds, they discovered surprising commonalities in values and perspectives. Both our peoples value knowledge, Windrunner observed during one such conversation. They simply define it differently. And on the evening of the second surveillance day, as the community prepared for possible emergence from their underground sanctuary, Windrunner approached Ellie with unusual formality. "Walk with me," he requested, gesturing toward one of the smaller adjoining chambers where crystalline formations created natural beauty despite the darkness. Curious about his solemn demeanor, Ellie followed. The chamber he chose offered relative privacy while remaining within appropriate distance of others, a consideration of propriety she recognized and appreciated. A single small lamp cast gentle illumination across mineral formations that sparkled, like ice, despite the moderate temperature. "Our people will likely return to the surface tomorrow," Windrunner began, his tone measured as though carefully selecting each word. "We must decide what comes after." The moment carried weight beyond. Its simple statement, a recognition that decisions made now would shape whatever future awaited them both. "Grey Fox and the Council have been discussing possibilities," he continued. "Some believe we should rejoin the main tribe, argue our case against Stonewolf's violence. Others suggest seeking new territory farther west, away from both white settlements and tribal conflicts." Ellie listened attentively, understanding that these tribal deliberations carried implications for her as well. "What do you believe is right?" she asked. Windrunner's gaze held hers steadily in the lamplight. "I believe paths that were separate may sometimes join. Not easily, not without difficulty, but perhaps with greater strength because of the joining." The metaphor's personal application was unmistakable, causing Ellie's heart to quicken despite her efforts at composure. "And the Council?" she asked. "What do they say about such joined paths?" "They are divided," Windrunner acknowledged. "But Grey Fox has spoken in favor. His voice carries weight beyond his years." A hint of something almost like humor touched his expression. "He says the teacher woman has proven herself worthy of our people, regardless of the color of her skin." Ellie absorbed this statement with growing wonder at its implications. "Are you asking me to stay with your people, permanently?" "I am asking if you would consider a life between worlds," Windrunner clarified. "Neither fully Comanche nor fully white settler. It would not be easy. Both sides would question, perhaps condemn." As they already do, Ellie observed softly, thinking of Lieutenant Chambers' suspicions and the growing distance she had felt from the trading post community. Windrunner nodded in acknowledgement of this reality. The question is whether what we might build together would be worth the difficulty. He reached slowly for her hand, the gesture deliberate and significant in its departure from Comanche, custom regarding unmarried women. I believe it would be. The simple statement, unadorned with elaborate declarations or promises, touched Ellie more deeply than flowery professions might have. It acknowledged the challenges while affirming the value of what they had discovered in each other, a connection that transcended cultural boundaries and conventional expectations. "So do I," she replied, her fingers curling around his with quiet certainty. Windrunner's expression softened in the lamplight, revealing a depth of feeling he rarely displayed publicly. "Then we face whatever comes together," he said simply, "as we have since the river." As dawn approached, its arrival sensed through some internal rhythm rather than visible evidence in their subterranean sanctuary, the scouts returned with confirmation that no army presence remained in the vicinity. The exodus began cautiously, families emerging in small groups with warriors, ensuring security at each stage. Ellie and Windrunner emerged together into morning sunlight that seemed almost painfully bright after days underground. The world above appeared transformed by their absence, more vivid, more precious for having been temporarily surrendered. Windrunner's hand found hers as they stood facing an uncertain but shared future, their silhouettes merging into a single, a form against the rising sun. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.